Hey everybody, tonight we're debating whether or not there is evidence for Bigfoot, and we are starting right now with Erica, our guest, Gutsick Gibbon, as she's known on YouTube. Thanks so much for being here, Erica. Erica, the floor is all yours.
Okay, this is awesome. I am so excited to be here. I for those of you who maybe don't know, because it's been a little bit of a hot minute since I've actually been here on Modern Day Debate. My name is Erica. I go by Gutsick Gibbon on YouTube. My background is I got my BSA in pre-professional animal science. I was on like that pre-vet path, and then I did a huge pivot and ended up doing my MRes in primatology, so primate biology, behavior, and conservation. I also picked up a minor in biology and a minor in anthropology. So I'm very, very excited to talk about Bigfoot today because Bigfoot is, or as we know, a hominoid, a proposed hominoid. And before I share my screen, or I guess while I'm sharing my screen, I suppose I should say, I am actually going to classify myself as a Bigfoot agnostic for today's conversation. Because I think that properly characterizes kind of where I'm at. And how we should sort of assess things like Bigfoot, things that we don't know very much about that have kind of support for it in either direction. So can you guys see this? Is this all good? Okay, let me see if I can figure out how to do the whole deal. I might just have to keep it. I might just have to keep it to this little deal unless someone, present. Okay, it's right there. Okay, much better. So Bigfoot debate. Erica, that's me, Gutsick Gibbon. So what's Bigfoot? Well, Bigfoot is a colloquial word for some kind of currently undiscovered hominoid. Now, Bigfoot, the colloquial usage tends to refer to the North American cryptid, but cryptic hominoids are pretty characteristic of most cultures. A lot of cultures tend to have these wild men archetypes, and they range from being, some hairy dude living out in the woods to being something that can truly be interpreted as this kind of apish hominid. So as a hominoid, Bigfoot tends to be characterized by a large size, obligately bipedal locomotions, with walking on 2 feet, thick hair, a sagittal crest in both sexes, and potentially facial hair, but it depends on who you ask. So what's the big question? Well, the big question is, we've got thousands of Bigfoot reports throughout the years and dozens of proposed videos of such animals. So is there a large and unknown hominoid lumbering across several continents, or in the case of tonight, North America? And I'm going to kind of start with my big issues to convert me from being a Bigfoot agnostic. So, of course, there's the obvious, the lack of a body or conclusive video footage. Now, I use conclusive there very loosely because I'm sure we're going to be talking about the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is, in my opinion, some of the best evidence in favor of this cryptic North American hominoid. Then there's the lack of fossil record in North America and along these proposed migratory or movement paths across the Bering Strait and things of that nature from areas like Europe during the Miocene. Another one that I tend to think about when I'm assessing this kind of thing is metabolic challenges for these large North American hominids and how they're going to meet these challenges without detection. So what I mean by that is Bigfoot's big. Bigfoot is proposed to be big. He's or she, they are large hominids that require massive caloric intake in order to maintain these large body sizes. And in the case of large animals, they tend to have to consistently eat food if they're even remotely herbivorous. Even omnivores tend to have to spend a lot of their time, browsing and doing things of that nature. Although I know Bigfoot is proposed to be an omnivore, which is very interesting. And then that kind of touches on the last thing, which is evidence that exists that is occasionally contradictory. So an example that I'm sure we'll talk about later is like in the Patterson-Gimlin film, Patty, the subject of the film, she has these large pendulous breasts, but she also has a sagittal crest, which is typically a male trait in extant hominoids. So, and I think we'll touch on that a bit in a minute. So here's another thing. Cryptid hominoids have been found before. I think that's something that isn't appreciated very often. When we propose that there's, a new animal, we tend to forget that there's been periods of time when most animals were new to most people. And a great example of that is the most recent, in my opinion, sort of large hominid that has been discovered, which is the billy ape. This is a subgroup of Pantroglodytes swinefurthii that was actually discovered in the Congo after decades of being this mythic lion-killing chimp. And it was found by rigorous expedition in the Congo rainforest, which is just an enormous tract of land, using known location. And DNA testing revealed that the billy ape was in fact a chimpanzee, albeit a relatively unique population. It's got its own sort of novelties to it, primarily in its behavior, which is very bizarre in how it interacts with humans, and how different populations of this subspecies interact with humans. But the point is that to me, the billy ape represents something of a double-edged sword if you're going to be kind of a Bigfoot proponent, which is that you've got this hominid, the subspecies of Pentroglodytes, living in perhaps one of the most remote areas in the world. And we did still find it, and we found several of them. They are social living, so it's a bit easier. But I would imagine, at least from what I've read about proposed Sasquatch and the like, they do have an element of sociality to them, despite being, typically on par with orangutans in their solitary behavior. They still do tend to group occasionally. Now, I'm sure that Dr. Meldrum has seen this one before, the genetic analyses of samples attributed to Yeti, Bigfoot, and other anomalous primates, and none of them came back, at least in North America. I am aware that there are some issues with this study, but I think that it is notable to bring it up simply because the North American specimens tended to be of known families, even getting down to the species level. None of them were popping back as order primates, which I think is worth bringing up. And the same thing was found sort of in this 2017 paper in the Himalayas when they were looking more specifically at Yetis, and they came back as ursids. But interestingly enough, a very interesting or very strange kind of, not necessarily hybridization, but we're getting very ancient DNA back from some bears that perhaps are no longer even in the area. So what's the best evidence for Bigfoot, Sasquatch, in my opinion? Well, it's going to be your trace evidence. So this is going to be primarily trackways and things like dermatoglyphs. And for those of you who don't know, dermatoglyphs are essentially like the ridges of your fingers, the ridges of your fingerprints, but they exist on your feet and toes as well. And some of these trackways are proposed to show dermatoglyphs, and Dr. Meldrum, I'm sure, will bring up some of that. I'd love to discuss it. And then there's videos, primarily, in my opinion, the Patterson-Gimlin film. It's the classic, it's the famous one, and it must be said that film has never been conclusively debunked, as it were. That is just the case of the matter. Now, there are things that we can nitpick about it, as I'm sure I'm probably going to do in this conversation. But that being said, it hasn't been conclusively tossed out the window. So I think that's worth mentioning as well. And then, of course, there's eyewitness accounts. And while a single eyewitness account holds no weight, really, when we're talking about a cryptid, because there's so many different factors at play that could account for it, there is a large number of Bigfoot sightings. And that's something that I think is worth addressing as well. So Patterson-Gimlin film, it's fascinating. In my opinion, there are some problems with it. There's the situation surrounding the filming that can be considered by some as being suspicious, although from what I've looked into it, it does tend to rely on circumstantial evidence. You've got Robert Patterson. He's showing up in this location on Bluff Creek, and he is actively looking for hominid trackways. That's why he was there. He and Gimlin were there. Now, they weren't actually suspecting, at least as the accounts go, to see a hominid. But they were looking for trackways, and people tend to point to that and say, okay, that's really suspicious. But in their favor, they had heard reports that Bluff Creek had these trackways, so they went to go check them out there, as one would if you're looking for, a creature that's making the tracks. You go to the place where the tracks were last seen. But there's some interesting bits where, Patterson had told Gimlin, if we see it, let's not shoot it, which, unless we absolutely have to, which some people interpret as being like, I've hired a guy in a suit, don't shoot him or else, he'll sue us. So there's a lot of weird things there. There's the issue where the local trackway hoaxer claims to have sent Patterson that way. It depends on how much weight you put on individual accounts. But for me, as far as the situation surrounding it, I don't consider it as much worth looking into as the actual subject of the film, which is Patty. Now, Patty's got a sagittal crest. That's the crest that runs along the top of the skull. And it's particularly important for animals that spend a lot of time browsing and chewing their food. These are usually heavy-duty herbivores. And Patty's got a big one. They tend to be only for males as well. I mean, females tend to have small ones in most gorilla populations, but this is a big, dimorphic trait in our existing hominids. We sometimes see them in females, not very often. And she's also got large pendulous breasts, which don't tend to mesh together with me as someone who, looks at a lot of primates. I tend to see sagittal crest, I think male, and then I see, breasts, especially the kind that Patty's sporting, which she's quite well endowed for for a hominid, unless perhaps she's lactating, which I've heard Dr. Meldrum proposed before, and I'm interested to discuss as well. Patty also has very lowly defined glutes in the picture, which conflicts, in my opinion, with some other Sasquatch trace evidence. So in this next picture here, this is actually from Dr. Meldrum, I believe, and he has outlined in this picture sort of the difference between the kinds of costumes that folks are putting out around that time period. Planet of the Apes came out 3 years after the Patterson-Gimlin film did. And frankly, the costumes are pathetic in comparison. The Patterson-Gimlin film subject, if it's a hoax, is an excellent, excellent hoax. But that second picture of Patty there kind of caught my eye because and I've got this from Dr. Meldrum's book here, there's some trace evidence of these glutes here on the left, a buttocks imprint found that's been associated with Sasquatch tracks. And I saw that and I was like, it's quite strange. This is very well defined and not so much in the Patterson-Gimlin film. And so I thought to me that kind of, I'd like to discuss that with Jeffrey here because I thought that was kind of interesting. Another thing that I think is kind of strange, and I also got these from Dr. Meldrum's book, is I feel this is my untrained eye speaking, so I hope we can discuss this a little bit, that there isn't a solid, consistent foot form. They tend to be relatively flat-footed, that's true, but they seem to have these different topographies, a lot of these trackways that we're pulling up from, these proposed critters. So I'd like to kind of discuss that, whether or not in Dr. Meldrum's experience, does this fall within a normal range of variability or not? So I think that would be quite interesting. So for my opponent, what is your best supportive Bigfoot for your opinion? And why have we not found trace evidence for such an animal? Because for me, the thing that I really want to dig into is this proposed morphology for the animal, the proposed behavior for the animal, including how it's going to meet these metabolic needs, as well as what's the deal with the fossil record. Typically, when you've got megafauna like this, they tend to leave some kind of trace for themselves. Even in areas that are just dreadfully poor for preservation, we at least find teeth. The same is true for gigantopithecines that we find over in China and Southeast Asia. And we recently found I believe it was a gibbon radius. It may have been a humerus, an arm bone from a gibbon, an ancient species of gibbon there, very small, very unimposing, but we did find it. So I'm interested to talk about kind of like why we're not finding the fossils for these critters. I recognize that the Pacific Northwest, man, that's not conducive to fossilization, but they had to get there somehow. And I'm thinking that since this likely descended from Dr. Meldrum's point of view, from a highly social animal, they're traveling in groups, right? So I'm kind of taking this, the strategy that I'm kind of going to take in this conversation is, again, it's going to be one of a Bigfoot agnostic. I want to pick your brain on this. I want to see kind of what kind of model we can make I want you to win me over, because the thing is, there isn't a primatologist out there who doesn't want Bigfoot to be real. That would be incredible. That would be earth-shattering. That would be remarkable. This animal would, depending on whether it descended from a paranthropine or Gigantopithecus, potentially be our closest living relative on the planet. So I want to be convinced. I'm dying to be convinced. And that's, I think, where I'm going to end it.
Thanks very much, Erica, for that opening statement. And what we are going to do is switch it over to Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum for his opening as well. I want to let you know first, folks, if this is your first time here, Modern Day Debate is a neutral platform hosting debates on science, religion, and politics. And we have many more juicy debates coming up in the future. So be sure to hit that subscribe button right now, as well as that notification button, so that you don't miss out on any of those upcoming debates. And thanks so much, Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum, for being with us again. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is all yours.
Well, thank you again for the invitation to be here and the opportunity to have an intelligent conversation. It's always a welcome opportunity. I must admit, I don't have as thoroughly prepared an opening statement to make. I just simply wanted to couch our embarking on this conversation with some general statements. And I think you've set the stage, Erica, wonderfully for that. But my experience in having conversations about the proposition and the supporting evidence for the possible existence of such a relic hominoid, I've found that it's really imperative for someone who is serious about investigating this to appreciate not only the scientific context in which it's to be placed, and you've done a great job of framing a number of parameters of that, but also the historical backdrop as well, understanding the timing of reactions of other academics and their statements, pro and con, against what was known at that particular time. And as we talk about the Patterson-Gimlin film, I think this will become extremely evident, and I'll cite some examples of some things that are said and often repeated, which at the time you might be able to justify. However, even now with 2020 hindsight, it's kind of hard to imagine that some of our predecessors in anthropology would actually make such inane statements, but they did, and some of that I really believe was prejudiced by the overarching backdrop of the prevailing paradigm that influenced anthropology dramatically in the 1960s, and that was the single species hypothesis, which predisposed the mindset away from agnosticism to an overt prejudice against the proposition that there were other than human or hominin, a single hominin species lineage leading to us. That was the basis of the single species hypothesis. And so that is very important. As I listen to your presentation too, it reminds me that that it also is important that there is clarity not only on the nature of the data, but the interpretation of the data. As I think as we address some of the perceived contradictions that you enumerated, Erica, that you'll see that the apparent contradiction stems from what I see as a misapprehension or misinterpretation of evidence. For example, just to illustrate one of those, and we'll come back to others, you repeatedly referred to the presence of a sagittal crest, and that's gotten a lot of discussion in the literature. The starting point I think that's important to make is that it's not definitive that there is a sagittal crest on the cranium of that film subject, if indeed that is a flesh and blood creature. There are some frames that give the impression that what you're seeing is actually the movement of hair, a shock of hair atop the head. There's no question that there's very little frontal eminence there that goes straight from the brow back to a high point, a bregma that's very posteriorly placed. But as to the development of a sagittal, I mean, even with observations of a living gorilla, what you see as far as the shape of the head of the gorilla is defined very little by the presence of a sagittal crest, and much more so by the top knot of fatty tissue, fibrous fatty tissue that sits atop the male gorilla's head. The crest itself is completely obscured by the presence of the massive temporalis muscle and fascia that cover it. Your comment about male versus female, and I didn't mean. I guess maybe we should hold off on this until we embark into the actual exchange and maybe take some of your things in a more systematic way. Or if you'd like, I'll finish this one point and then you can respond. But it has been demonstrated repeatedly by myself and others. My colleague Esteban Sarmiento, who has extensive experience with gorillas in the field and in the museum, gorilla skeletons, that there are numerous examples, not numerous, maybe I shouldn't say numerous, there are multiple examples of female gorillas that do sport a sagittal crest. And it, while there is sexual dimorphism, or it has always been attributed to sexual dimorphism, the presence of the arch or the ridge is a biomechanical feature. It provides attachment, as I alluded to, attachment for the temporalis muscle in the situation where the cranial vault surface area is insufficient to provide that alone. In chimpanzees, the relative size of the muscles to the cranial volume is sufficient that there is a very limited or no sagittal crest at all. That feature is not just or is not necessarily gender related, but size related. And so in an organism that is the dimensions of a Sasquatch, but has the cranial capacity proportionate to that of other great apes. Remember, surface area only increases to the square of linear dimensions, whereas the volume, or in this case, the mass of the temporalis muscle, will increase to the cube of those linear dimensions. You're going to be obligated to have an extra flange of bone in a larger animal, whether it happens to be a male or a female. So in either event, the one being that there actually is no apparent sagittal crest. I think there is. I do actually believe there is. Given the masticatory apparatus that's evident in the Patterson-Gimlin film, there has to be a big set of muscles, at least the size, of something like, even perhaps more so, in at least the anterior temporalis, more akin to a Paranthropus, as we've suggested. In which case, the sagittal crest of the Paranthropus isn't that similar to that of a gorilla. It's more anteriorly placed because the emphasis is on the anterior fibers of the temporalis for posterior loading of the dentition, as opposed to posterior emphasis of the temporalis for anterior loading of the prognathic gorilla, which does more processing with the anterior dentition. Anyway, but my point is simply some of the statements that you made, I would take a little bit of exception to or qualify, and those may actually clear up some of the apparent contradictions that you're citing between the different types of evidence. So with that said, and with the notion of a historical backdrop and a theoretical contextual framework within what is known about Sasquatch, what is known about hominoids generally, in order to discuss the plausibility. I think we're long past the point where anyone can intelligently and from an informed position say it's impossible for there to be such a thing as Sasquatch or an Almas even, or a Orang Pendek or a Yeti. We're past that. And anyone, honestly, quite bluntly, anyone, academic or non-academic, who says they can't, as was said to me by an anthropologist, they can't exist, therefore they don't exist, and it doesn't matter what evidence you think you have, has no basis for their argument. They are simply wearing their ignorance on their shirt sleeve, basically. So possibility is there. The question then is, what's the plausibility or probability that such a creature exists? And that then opens the door to some of your questions. What about the missing evidence? We've got this, we do have evidence. I mean, the introduction to our conversation was a little bit misworded, perhaps. It's there's no question that there's evidence of Sasquatch. The question is, what is the quality of the evidence? Is it persuasive or compelling as to the existence of Sasquatch? So we have evidence on one hand, we have missing evidence, and sometimes not necessarily the agnostics, but the skeptics, especially those with a capital S, have their favorite piece of missing evidence. And, I'm constantly confronted with that lack of evidence. Why don't you have this? Why don't you have this? And, it was so funny. One time I was confronted by, it was actually a department chair where I was invited, a university I was invited to speak at and hosted by an anthropology department. But he had asked that question during the Q&A, very reasonable question: where are the bodies? Where's the physical evidence. He was actually a forensic or archaeologist. And so in his mind, and as you've alluded to in a couple of your points, everything leaves a trace. As an archaeologist, that you're interested in that trace evidence, that what's left behind, what's the signature of the activities and presence of your subject matter. And so he really wanted to know where was the body. He couldn't understand that. And I gave him an answer. I think it's a reasonable answer. It's in trying to address the absence of evidence, it may come across as an apologist's answer. But it's a reasonable one. And so over dinner, when we had the opportunity, I asked him, I said, well, were you satisfied with that answer? No, I wasn't. And I said, well, I find it interesting that sometimes people who adopt a very skeptical position, they do so on the basis of their favorite missing piece of evidence, to the total distraction and ignoring of all the other evidence that does exist, the existing evidence that seems to be affirmative or suggestive at the very least. He said, what do you mean by that? What kind of evidence are you talking about? I said, weren't you sitting through my seminar? And I said, for me, the footprint evidence. His response was, well, I'm not an expert in footprints. Well, don't you think that I'm, deserving of the deference to my expertise as I would be deferent to your expertise in forensic anthropology or archaeology? So the tone of the conversation changed just a little bit. So I'm looking forward to our conversation in a very positive tone.
Absolutely. We are thrilled to have you here, both of you, and want to let you know, folks, our guests are linked in the description, and that includes if you're listening to Modern Day Debate via podcast, because we do have a podcast for Modern Day Debate in which we put all of the debates, and want to let you know, folks, in the episode description box below the podcast, you can find our links for our guests there as well, and we encourage you to check on those. And also, one last friendly reminder, as I'd say 99.9% of you do a phenomenal job, and we appreciate it so much that you guys attack the arguments instead of the person. That's what we like, and so we appreciate that, and we want to continue to encourage that. And so with that, we will kick it over to Erica and Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum for this open discussion.
Yes, I said it before, I'll say it again. I'm super excited for this. And I want to make it very clear. I've said this to others, and I want to make it clear for everyone who's maybe watching. If there was ever anyone more qualified to talk about Sasquatch specifically, it's Dr. Jeffrey Meldrum here. I mean, he specializes in hominin foot morphology and locomotion, things of that nature. And that due respect, I agree, is 100% earned. So I want to defer to you on that, as I should, I think. For me, it's, I want to treat this as an opportunity for me to kind of like I said earlier, pick your brain a little bit. And I know we kind of talked about in our email exchange, or the planning of this debate, the kinds of things that we were planning on discussing, what is sufficient what kind of evidence is sufficient, I suppose. The Patterson-Gibbon film and trace evidence like footprints. Mm-hmm. And I think kind of how we were kind of slapping going a little bit on the Patterson-Gibbon film, I think that's a good place to start for the two of us. Because in my opinion, and I don't know if you would agree, but as far as visual evidence, that is the holy grail, right? This is the main one. Everyone's seen it. And I was very impressed in my preparation for this conversation that it really hasn't been conclusively debunked. Now, that being said, not being conclusively debunked, in my opinion, is also not sufficient to say that it is an overwhelming support for the existence of a relic hominid in North America. And I think the reason is because in my reading about it, there's a lot of things that we don't know for sure about the Patterson-Gibbon film, with 100% certainty, things like the frame rate, and the whole timeline about getting it developed, things of that nature, that I think if we could only have access to it, like the original footage as well, get it into our hands, that would change a lot. That would give us a lot more information that would be really helpful. But I kind of want to ask you, so you're of the opinion that Patty, the subject of the Patterson-Gibbon film, is a female. Yes.
I am.
So I've read like Napier's comments on the Patterson-Gimlin film, and Napier, curiously enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's a primatologist, and he also kind of discussed how he was like he is a acceptor, believer, however you want to put it. He is in favor of the hypothesis that there are American hominids, but he doesn't buy the Patterson-Gimlin film,
Right.
which I think is very interesting. And one thing that he kind of touches on as a support against it is the gait of Patty. She walks in a very masculine fashion, right? Yeah. And in your book, you kind of discuss how, okay, this is to be expected if we're dealing with, a relatively small-brained hominid. There was very little sexual dimorphism kind of in the movement of our Miocene apes and things of that nature, in all likelihood. Nor is there very much difference in chimps. But I saw that, and I wanted to ask you a question, because to my understanding, the evolution of bipedality lends itself to a horrible conundrum for females of a species, especially with primates, because you've got to keep that birth canal, narrow enough to stay an efficient biped or to become an efficient biped, but it's also going to be wide enough to give birth. So how do you suppose, because I see Patty, I see that she's got a masculine gait, or I mean, I'm not an expert on that, but I'm told that she's got a masculine gait, see that. And then I think to myself, okay, to me, that's got to lend itself a little bit, at least, to kind of support against, because if she is a female, would she not have a feminine gait, considering she's got that bowl-shaped pelvis and that sort of saunter that we tend to associate with wider hips, paleontologically speaking?
I mean, you touched on the key point right there in your last utterance there, wider hips. Why would she have wider hips unless it was constrained by an enlargement of the birth canal to accommodate a large-brained baby? Without that constraint, the hips, the interacetabular or distance between the hip joints, is going to be comparable between a male or a female. There's no enlargement. That's what gives that wider interacetabular distance is what gives the sway to the female pelvis when walking. There's a greater cantilever kind of a principle going on there, as weight is balanced over or vaulted over the support limb. If when the swing limb is elevated, the tendency is for the pelvis to drop to that side. Paralysis of the glutes on this side produces what's called the Trendelenburg syndrome or sign, where with each step the pelvis tends to drop, and so the patient will throw their arm. If you've ever seen a the chimpanzee walk, like they're walking on a tightrope. Well, they do that because they don't have the rearrangement of the medial or the gluteus medius and gluteus minimus around to the lateral side, so that now they're abductors of the hip rather than extensors, as the gluteus maximus remains. So in short, I mean, that's one of the statements that's an embarrassment to the discipline. Quite honestly, that the only one that supersedes that is the one was made by oh shucks, now I just went blank on his name, but he was an expert on primate skin, and he thought it was laughable that here she was presented as a female with the breasts, but yet those breasts were covered with hair. And everyone knows that all primates are essentially devoid of hair over the breasts. Wrong, at least not the primatologists of this generation don't make such assertions. And if anyone has any doubts, a simple experiment you can do is just step out, ladies, step out of the shower into a cold room and check for the distribution of goosebumps over your body. And if there's a goosebump, that's a hair follicle with an erector pili muscle attached to it. No matter how fine, how ephemeral that hair is, the muscle is still present. And if you have goosebumps over your breast, you have latent hair follicles present as well. And they're responsive to androgens. Females with hormonal imbalances can experience not proliferation, but the expression of coarser hair in a male pattern distribution. And so anyway, that the remark about the female to male walk is also misses the point entirely.
Do
Yep.
you suppose, though, kind of a question on that? Because from my understanding, the nature of this adaptation to bipedality does have to do with the architecture of the pelvis. So the reason why, for instance, chimps and gorillas, when penguins, I suppose, and gorillas, when they stand up and they've got that bow-legged stance as they're kind of shambling along, and like you said, it's like you're on a tightrope, is in part because of that pelvic architecture that was one of the first things to change when we start to see this adaptation of bipedality in the Australopithecines, and depending on who you talk to, Ardipithecus ramidus, and even if really Aureopithecus and some of those Miocene apes, depending on who you talk to, because they're still kind of up in the air. But I'm thinking that like, I guess, help me out on the understanding on what that pelvis architecture would look like that simultaneously lends itself to this kind of awkward masculine gait for both sexes that at the same time makes this animal such an efficient biped. Because when you see this thing move across, when you see her, she's moving across the frame, she's zooming. She's covering that. She's in, I would think if anyone would agree, these guys are good at walking on 2 feet if they do indeed wander the Pacific Northwest.
Now, did I hear you correctly? Were you saying that males walk awkwardly?
Oh, no, okay,
no,
sorry.
Okay.
No. What I was saying is the difference between, there's like,
right.
You can tell the difference between males and females, how they distribute their weight when they move,
Yes.
like biomechanically.
Yep.
And my question is, even though that distant, like, I guess what I was saying is that you noted that the way that Patty kind of holds herself, it is masculine, not a problem, because it's quite similar to how, like, their pelvic architecture is. I guess what I'm asking is how it's going to lend itself to a more awkward gait that we see in Patty, a more masculine gait, and then at the same time lend itself to efficient bipedality.
Well, obviously the principal rearrangement of the pelvis or elaboration. I mean, this is, first of all, let me back up. There's a common misconception, and it stems from the idea that we evolved from a chimpanzee-like ancestor.
Right.
And true, it is in many respects more chimpanzee-like than it is modern human-like.
Sure.
But when it comes to the pelvis, the pelvis of the African apes, and to a lesser degree the Asian apes, the orangutan, has derived tremendously in a direction towards a very specialized brachiation type of movement, arm hanging movement. And with that has come a shortening of the lumbar spine and a elongation of these very forwardly directed iliac blades. And so the human, on the other hand, has, as you described, a more bowl-like in that the iliac blades have curved around. They're very short and they're curved around anteriorly, which brings as I mentioned, the lesser gluteals into a position to function as as abductors, the lesser gluteals as abductors, which is the principal bipedal adaptation, so that we don't have to swing our body mass back and forth, balancing over each leg. These muscles, and you can test this as you walk down, to just take a step, put your hand on your hip, and you'll feel the lesser gluteals flex as you swing that leg, the leg of that side, forward, or the opposite leg, the contralateral leg. The support limb, those muscles fire to keep the pelvis from dropping on the swing side.
Right.
Okay. And that is what, therefore, then we don't have to incorporate a shift of center of mass above the waist, and we can use our arms to swing and employ the moment of inertia created by the swinging arm in a very effective way.
Okay, so if I'm understanding this correctly, and I'm just trying to steel man kind of what we just went through here. So the idea is essentially that the hominids, hominids, I guess I should say, the hominids that both extant humans and other extant great apes kind of descended from had this much less derived pelvis between the two of us. Like it wasn't more chimp-like. It was almost a mosaic between what we see now and we've got in chimps. So that kind of leads me to my next question, because in anthropology, I'm sure you know, I'm preaching to the choir here. There's the question right now with the Miocene hominids, again, sorry, hominids,
Yeah.
whether or not humans, who I'm using as our template for the trackway to bipedality, whether or not they evolved from kind of a suspensory ancestor with that up and down posture, or from a knuckle walking quadruped.
Right.
So my question for you is, because in your book, it seems that you very strongly allude to this Gigantopithecus ancestry for a Sasquatch. So how do you suppose we're getting that bipedality from something like Gigantopithecus? How do you make that movement? Because at least from the little we understand, or do you suppose Gigantopithecus wasn't a quadruped?
I don't assume that it was a quadruped. And I don't think anyone is justified in assuming that it's a quadruped, even though that's the default position that many resort to, because they assume, again, it's an assumption. They assume that bipedalism is a strictly synapomorphic character unique to the hominini.
Yeah.
Or hominidae, I guess, or whichever, the hominins.
Yes.
That defines the clade to which we belong and our immediate ancestors since the divergence from an ancestor. But as you've alluded to by enumerating some of these other Miocene apes like Oreopithecus and Ardipithecus, which almost certainly in my mind was not a special case that was a hominin. There's very little justification for that, in my opinion. And then recently there was another Dusinensis. No, not Dusinensis. Danuvius was another species recently described and was attributed with very, very likely with at least an orthograde posture, if not capable of bipedal locomotion. So the point being is, and this was kind of where I was driving with this by emphasizing the fact that we did not evolve from a chimpanzee ancestor. We evolved from a chimp-like, but one that, if you focus on the pelvis, had a much more generalized pelvis. You look at Ardipithecus, and the problem with that is Ardipithecus pelvis was smashed into a bazillion pieces. And, they reconstructed it, but they kind of reconstructed it to the dimensions and shape that they were anticipating, and it's not a reproducible method, in my opinion. But nevertheless, the point being that a number of these Miocene apes had pelvises that would require much less modification to become Australopithecine-like and eventually human-like,
right,
than if you started off with something that looked and walked like a chimpanzee.
Right.
So Gigantopithecus, it's assumed, because it's not a hominin. It's the most recent analysis that actually compared DNA attributed, placed it most closely to Asian apes, the orangutan.
Right.
Well, bear in mind, the orangutan isn't representative of all Asian apes. It's one surviving species and a highly specialized example. So placing Gigantopithecus amongst the Asian apes, we shouldn't fall prey to the temptation to say, well, it was just a big orangutan.
Yeah.
But it probably had, as did so many of the Miocene apes, have rearrangement of the shoulder girdle, the pectoral girdle, for overhead arm hanging or climbing postures and positional behaviors. There were probably some, like Shivapithecus, for example.
That's what I was going to bring up. Yeah.
Its postcranium seems to be much more quadrupedal, almost more monkey-like.
Right.
And the big difference between apes and monkeys is monkeys are cursorial. They're cursorial quadrupeds, whether they're terrestrial like baboons or semi-terrestrial, or whether they're arboreal quadrupeds. But yet they have gone through a period of evolution where their skeleton has been remodeled to more resemble your dog or cat than, say, a spider monkey. And so that means their thorax is compressed. The shoulder blades are vertical to align with and extend the motions of the humerus. in contrast to apes, which tend to be more brachiators. They have the flattened chest. I mean, the reason we have a chest that looks more like a chimp than it looks like a baboon is that we are capable of doing things that a baboon can't do in on the jungle gym, at recess. Our playground is a perfect testament to our legacy of tree climbing.
Yeah.
And so now take that, one of the arguments for the highly modified form of quadrupedalism found in chimps and gorillas, and when they are on the ground and aren't rolling like a ball, orangutans, is that the arrangement of the shoulder joint is such that when we come down on all fours, now start at the shoulder, our shoulder blade now is on the back of the rib cage, slight angle, but it meets the humerus like this, not like this. Bones tolerate compression really well, but they don't tolerate shear. And those same kinds of modifications of the elbow and the wrist that allow for that full extension and twisting of the wrist, such that when we go down to do push-ups, why do some people buy these little hand grips to put on the floor to do push-ups? Well, the same reason when I do push-ups, I do them on the backs of my knuckles so I can keep my wrists straight, because when I put my hand like that, man, it really hurts here across the capitate and or not the capitate, but the scaphoid and the lunate there. So imagine all of those constraints to going down to all fours that might have predisposed some of these hominin ancestors to which were already rather upright from their climbing in the trees. When they came to the ground, it made more sense to just stay on their hind limbs. Now, if you amplify those shortcomings of the skeleton in an animal that weighs in excess of 1,000 pounds, when they come to the ground, what are the odds if it turns out that Gigantopithecus went through a suspensory or a climbing phase, as so many Miocene apes did, but then as it gained this tremendous size, it doesn't make any sense to go up in the trees.
Yeah, well, it can't support it. Yeah, it wouldn't.
Right, can't support it. So it's on the ground. So at the very least, you've got a 50-50 chance of either walking on two legs or walking on four. What I have just described, in my opinion, tips the scale towards the direction of bipedalism,
right,
and independent evolution of bipedalism, but nevertheless an argument that can be made that, I expect that when they come out of one of those Vietnamese caves with a Gigantopithecus femur, it's going to look like a hominid.
Wouldn't that be incredible? I hope we find one. I hope we get one, because I've been dying for more Gigantopithecus. It drives me nuts. And I love hylobatids, but it drives me nuts that we're finding little hylobates, remains before we're finding anything from this gigantic hominid from Southeast Asia. But I that leads me to ask, because and I'm dreadfully curious. The pressures are very trackable, climatically speaking, that led many of the Miocene apes, and then of course many of the kind of savanna dwellers of small woodland forests in the Eastern African Rift. What drove them down from the trees, as it were?
Sure.
So to my understanding, part of the reason why, and I have looked into this a bit, because we see this really weird thing in Southeast Asia. For maybe those of you who don't know, I'm sure you know this already, Dr. Meldrum, but where we see these two weird adaptations with the hylobatids, the gibbons, and the our members of Pongo, and Gigantopithecus. And the Gigantopithecines get really big, and the gibbons get very small. And it's almost, at least what I've seen, it's been proposed that you've got kind of like a climatic shift in resources. So how do you suppose that tracks for driving these animals to a bipedal stance in these rainforests? Because that seems very counterintuitive to me.
Well, if there was, and I'm not 100% yet confident or conclusive about what the range of Gigantopithecus is in Asia, in Eastern Asia. Mm-hmm. Our fossil record, you're right that we have found them, but we've just barely found traces of Gigantopithecus. We've got, for 1.5 million years of tenure, 2 jaws and a few thousand isolated teeth. Yeah. And the critical thing is we only have those because porcupines took them into the caves, dragged those bits into the caves and chewed them up. And see, that may be the limiting factor. It's just the spurious jaw that a porcupine can manage to drag. A gigantic femur of a big ape like that may be too big for a porcupine to get into to drag up the hill into the cave. Who knows? Because then when you go north of the Yellow River, there are representatives of that same community, but there are no Gigantopithecus teeth or fossils found in any of the limestone caves which are present there. It seems that there's this formula. You have to have a limestone cave, and you have to have Gigantopithecus, and you have to have a porcupine to concentrate the fossils. Without the concentrator, the Gigantopithecus don't frequent the caves. They're not inhabitants of the caves, and so their fossils are never going to be produced north there. But if they were, if there was a movement of this population with the forests and with fragmentation, perhaps it's the exposure to climatic changes in the northern latitudes that's selected for increased body size, just as I mean, they were not let's dispel that misnomer. They were not bamboo specialists. They weren't restricted to bamboo forests. Yes, there's evidence of phytoliths, but you read that paper carefully.
They've got pitting too. They've got pitting as well.
Well, but pitting that's caused by the phytoliths in some grass. If you read that original paper by Shahan, there were 4 teeth. Only 2 of them had the phytoliths, and he didn't identify 2 species, the grasses the phytoliths came from. Just assumed they must be bamboo. They were eating bamboo because this panda bear model. And so, but if you if you look at the studies that have been done, both surface wear, micro wear, but more recently stable isotope analysis of the teeth have clearly shown that their diet was Catholic. They were generalized omnivores. They were not bamboo specialists. So all of those musings and modelings and so forth about both their distribution and their behavior are on very, very clay feet.
So if I may, I want to kind of push back on you a little bit there, because I would propose that not being able to isolate a specific diet to a specific grass, sedge, or bamboo, what makes you suppose that leads to omnivory, though?
The stable isotope analysis.
Oh, right. Okay.
Most similar. But even before that, Daglin and Grein did a much more thorough paper looking at microwear analysis and did a very extensive comparative, and came to the conclusion that the wear patterns were most similar to chimpanzees, that they were eating, not even an herbivore like a gorilla. Well, a gorilla isn't a strict herbivore. They do, when it's present, they do take fruits, and they'll even do, invertebrate protein when it's possible. But anyway, but there was no support for a highly specialized diet. I mean, whatever their diet was, it was clearly coarse and required a lot of mastication, as evidenced by the very thick molar enamel and the greatly reduced canines.
Yeah.
Allow for that amplified phase 2, that side-to-side grinding of the chewing cycle. And so that, in that respect, functionally, it's very convergent with the adaptations of the paranthropines.
Right. Yeah.
With hyperthick enamel, molarized premolars, reduced canines.
Megadont teeth. Big monsters. Right. So, but then with chimpanzees, and of course it varies on population, certainly.
Sure.
Because they're totally, same with bonobos, all penins. You've got opportunistic and even intentional omnivory from the likes of, like you said, small invertebrates or frogs, to the active hunting of duiker or colobus monkeys.
Right.
But it still makes up a very small portion of their diet. And I'm thinking to myself, if we're talking about something like Gigantopithecus or a Sasquatch for that matter, which is these very, very large animals,
right.
Very similar to the recent, or I guess it's not that recent, but the work that's been done on Neanderthal, like caloric intake, because they weren't as tall as us, but they probably were a bit more robust in their body size.
Yeah, much
and they required enormous enormous caloric intake, which is why when they would go and hunt, they would specifically take the organs and the very high calorie yields from the animals that they killed. So that leads kind of to my next question, which is whether it's with Gigantopithecus or with the Sasquatch, how are we meeting these metabolic needs in such a way that we're still not stumbling across these guys? Because the likes of, you mentioned in your book, Rhinopithecus roxanella, the snow monkeys, they maintain their diets in these northerly climates by going in and pulling back tree bark and eating lichen and lichen and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not seeing that as working for a critter the size of a Sasquatch.
Well, a couple of things. One, I don't want to, on the basis of comparing the possible diet of primates that are in subtropical to tropical environments to one that is hypothetically in a temperate environment,
right?
And we don't know what their their behavior is during the winter, whether hibernation is part of their adaptation or whether estivation or dozing, like a bear.
That would be super unique.
Yeah, but and especially in light of some of the recent publications that not only in the Human Genome Project elucidated some of our genetic hardware that suggests that we have homologous genes to which in humans apparently has been suggested control circadian rhythms, but that are homologous to genes that moderate hibernating behaviors in other mammals. And then the recent paper about Neanderthals, and I'm grasping here, but there was a paper that on the basis of, it was something to do with the bone remodeling that suggested that they had annual periods or daily periods of, not daily, but seasonal periods of inactivity, of reduced activity and reduced metabolic activity that suggested the authors that perhaps Neanderthals were hibernating or at least estivating for extensive periods of time, which is really interesting. I mean, it's always I always rebuff the retort that primates don't hibernate. Well, it only takes one mutation, or at least one adaptation in a species. Look at vertebrates or carnivores. Take the order carnivores. How many carnivores hibernate? One. So if you're going to generalize, and if you didn't know about bears and you're going to generalize from all existing carnivores and say, well, they don't hibernate, it's impossible to conceive of a carnivore that hibernates, well, then you would rule out the existence of bears before the fact. Likewise, that's the problem. So especially when there's all this suggestive evidence.
I agree on that point. I don't think that like rarity certainly does not suggest impossibility. And I would even propose, and you mentioned this in your book as well, we've got some strepsirrhines that hibernate.
That's right, during the dry season.
I wouldn't put that out of the realm of possibility, but I would push back with Rhinopithecus roxanella and with Japanese macaques, Macaca fuscata, because they live in these environments that I would at least suppose on the pressure end of things,
right,
kind of push them towards that, sort of prime them rather for that kind of adaptation.
Sure.
And so to me, although to your point, I would imagine that it would be much more difficult for a larger animal. Like I think, no, but then we see a lot of small animals, members of like rodents, etc., that also engage in like hibernation style activity. So I don't know. I think I would have to put a pin in that. Yeah, I would have to put a pin in that because that seems to me just so. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that's impossible. So what do you think they're consuming?
Well, pretty much everything. I mean, there's that is edible. Now you've got and I have to defer. I don't have the expertise. I work closely with an ethnobotanist who knows these things inside and out, and he's working. he's done several very interesting presentations on this subject, and I've been pushing him to get it written up so that I can study it more intimately myself. But for example, he shows this one slide. You can't read it because it's so exhaustive, the length of all of the species that grizzly bears are known to eat, all the plant species, and it's amazing, the diversity. And then he has reviewed the plant families that are represented in, say, gorilla diets. And many of those have vicars or have comparable species here. And those could be added. He then also lists all of the plants that humans typically utilize for edibles. Indigenous populations have historically used and still continue in some instances. So when you consider a bear is able to make a living, yes, they do hibernate, but that requires that they actually take in and consume much more by way of total calories in preparation for that period of inactivity. A great ape, one of the arguments that has been made against the possible existence of Sasquatch is that you've already got a large omnivore, right? Bears are present already, so how would you partition that niche? Well, omnivory is a pretty broad brushstroke, but if you look at the alternate origins of these two large omnivores, bears derived from a canid-like or carnivore ancestor with a simple gut and carnassials and the dentition and the jaw structure of a carnivore. The bear has widened out those teeth a bit. It has certainly elaborated the small intestine, however, not so much the large intestine. On the other hand, you've got, if Bigfoot exists, it's almost certainly derived from some form of ape or early hominin, which is basically a bipedal ape. So it's probably derived from a frugivore, folivore ancestor, maybe some protein, as we talked about. But it has a much more capacious gut, especially the large intestine, because the great apes are largely large intestine hindgut fermenters in order to detoxify and digest this folivorous diet.
Sure.
Well, if Sasquatch is derived from that, it has then the ability to consume, to masticate, the jaws of that you see on Paddy, or the jaws of either a Gigantopithecus derivative or a Paranthropine derivative, are going to be able to process foods that really are not available to a bear from the mechanical end. But then add to that also the gut physiology. Many primates are capable of digesting and detoxifying secondary compounds that make many plants unpalatable to other animals, and have a slow gut passage time, which, Patty's big. She doesn't have a huge pot belly that's evident, but her torso is as thick front to back all the way down. I think it's that more bull-like pelvis. You don't get the appearance of a big pot belly suspended from this rather flat horizontal pelvis, iliac blades. So I think she's got a very capacious gut and capable of the gut passage time and so forth of a large folivore. And that opens up, that opens up a whole list of things that bears couldn't eat.
Yeah, I would agree with you. I don't really have an issue with two large omnivores kind of coexisting in the same area. There's plenty of things in the Pacific Northwest to exploit, regardless, depending on which omnivore you are. The thing that I would mainly point out with that is that when it comes to organisms that, like primates, for example, in this case, that spend a lot of time eating, which something of Patty's size would have to spend a lot of time doing, even if you account for even focused omnivory, because you're fueling this massive body.
Sure.
And anytime you're including omnivory, for instance, bears spend a whole lot of time foraging and hunting. That's just what and then they still sleep for half the year.
Sure.
So what I'm thinking is that in the case of gorillas, when there are folks who work out at these field sites, and they spend they're dedicated trackers. And one of the ways that makes it very easy for them to find gorillas as opposed to chimpanzees is when they forage, they leave massive traces of themselves, partially because they're social and it's a big group of them sitting in an area, stripping vegetation and chowing down all the time. But I'm thinking to myself, even if we're dealing with something solitary, if you've got this small population of Sasquatch living in the Pacific Northwest, and they're spending an awful lot of time eating and foraging and exploiting, especially, I would even posit, because they're exploiting so many different resources and resources that are not being exploited by bears and thus cannot be easily attributable to bears. I'm thinking, would you not think that by now someone would have stumbled across, perhaps someone even dedicated to the idea of sussing out what's going on with Sasquatch, and thought to themselves, okay, I've got this plant and something big has been eating it, or I've got this carcass and something big has been eating it. And forensically speaking, it's not matching up with the usual suspects of our ursids, right? Or even some smaller carnivorans. Mm-hmm. But what do you make of that?
Well, for one, as you point out, unless someone is out there to literally suss what Sasquatch is doing, there aren't people looking for such sign, and it's not that easy to recognize in the types of habitats, at least that I'm familiar with. Okay. Even when you have a herd of elk going through an area, yeah, you can find the twigs that have been nipped and so forth, and occasionally you can find where bears have ripped open stumps, and you can certainly see by the claw marks that it's a bear, but that even that sign from animals that are much more numerous is pretty ephemeral, and unless you're a real trained observer, you're not going to. And there just aren't people out there looking for that sign, and your average amateur enthusiast certainly isn't qualified. Even someone like myself I wouldn't profess to have the experience, have not spent the time. I mean, when I'm out there, I'm looking for trace evidence in the form of tracks whenever I can, and those other things, you watch for them, but and then I would just add to that, it's that moving needle in a haystack. I get the impression from the distribution of track finds and sightings, in given geographical regions, that and their infrequency, that these animals are probably moving, as you say, foraging. And they can be foraging constantly, but they're moving. Their resources tend to be rather dispersed, and so they don't leave dense concentrations of sign. I mean, a gorilla can sit down for the day and pretty much sit and forage without moving, just what he can gather within arm's length. And when he's done, he and all his cohorts in the troop have essentially mowed down or crushed down by their presence the vegetation. And I would wager you have perhaps glossed over it just a little bit, because my understanding from reading the various narratives and so forth, if you know where those gorillas were yesterday, it's pretty easy to find out where they are today.
That's true too. Well, and you've got dedicated folks who go out there. I mean, I've got field researchers who they go to sleep with the primate they're studying, right, and then they make their way back to base camp, and then they get up before they're awake, and then they travel back out and wake up with them at the site. So I would agree with that. I guess I'm more thinking from the perspective of like, because if it's me, if I'm out there and I'm looking kind of for support, I'm thinking to myself, if this is a true generalist, which it sounds like it's got to be level, and I'm looking at every turned over log or whatever, where and I'm saying to myself, okay, can I see signs of scraping nails or specific dentition, gnawing and things of that nature? And God, wouldn't it be amazing? You find the gnawed teeth and you get some saliva, and boom, like you've got your DNA, which would be superb. We would hope, right? Exactly. And that kind of leads me to my next question. I'm sort of peppering you with questions, I know.
Oh, that's good.
This is a good opportunity for me to kind of get your perspective on things. So has anyone done, and I'm sure you know this, which is why I'm asking, like an eDNA study out there? And for those of you who don't know out in the audience, just to let everyone know. So the way an eDNA stands for environmental DNA. And it's basically you take a bunch of water samples, soil samples, etc., and then you scan these vast series of samples for trace DNA of local critters, because as animals ourselves, we leave our skin cells all over the place, and most animals do the same thing. And so you tend to get a decent-ish idea about what's lurking around in the area.
Right. Yes.
Sorry, go ahead.
We did a preliminary associated with these ground nests that were found in the Olympic Peninsula that were attributed or potentially attributable to Sasquatch. They were discovered by a timber cruiser who was marking out timber on private timber land, an area behind a gate, but yet miles down the road into the area, and then miles from the road, he was out traveling cross country, marking out sections for logging, and stumbled on this site. It's an interesting story in of itself. But to make a long story short, for eDNA, I had the opportunity to go and take core samples from the center of these nests. They were submitted to Todd Dissetel, one of the only molecular anthropologists who will interact with us on this subject,
right,
for DNA analysis. He did a rather cursory study looking at cytochrome oxidase 2, I think he was the gene he was looking at on the mitochondria, but he only did a short segment. He didn't do very much. And he said that it was, he had a whole litany of forest creatures that you would expect to be in that area, and human. And that was the only primate represented, was human. And I pressed him on how confident was he, because I mean, if we're talking about something that's, say, a paranthropine derivative, we're talking about something that could be 1% or half of 1% different than us genetically.
I see.
And so I said, have you looked at enough sequence? He said, well, this particular stretch that I looked at, when you compared humans and Neanderthals differ by 3 substitutions. So it should be able to pick up something that is more distantly related to us than Neanderthals. And I said, well, but that's Neanderthal evolution. That you're making a big assumption based on a small sample that the creature in question would also differ from us in at least those substitutions, if not more. It may differ from us somewhere else in the genome by a lot more, but happen to be identical to us on those. Well, and I discussed this with a number of other geneticists, and they all concur. They said, because what happens is if we do test that saliva or we do test that hair and do get DNA, invariably so far it comes back as human. And the conclusion is, well, it's either contamination from handling the sample, or you've just misidentified a human sample, a human hair or a human source. But the third possibility that has to be chased down all the way is, if this animal is that closely related to us, potentially, it's going to take a lot of DNA to be confident that you're not simply writing it off prematurely. It's like, for the person that's not familiar with these techniques and so forth, just imagine you have an Advent calendar and with a bunch of little doors, leading up to Christmas, with a little sweet behind each one. But instead, we're going to have segments of DNA, and say instead of 24 doors, we've got 1,000. Well, if this creature is 1/10 of 1% different than us, then that means only 10 doors in that out of that 1,000 are going to hold information that will discriminate between the two species. But if you finance a study that opens up only 10 doors out of those 1,000, what are the odds that by chance you get one of the, one that has the golden ticket in it? And if
you're thinking we're just not covering enough.
Right. Yeah, we're not covering enough. Well, by chance. Go ahead.
I was just going to say my pushback on that, I guess, would be like, humans and Neanderthals, the general number they throw around is 99.7% across, for coding base pairs, which is, right. It's very similar, but we're also 98.8% Pannin. So it's, that 0.3% carries a decent bit of weight. I mean, we are different species. Potentially. Yeah, we are different species from Neanderthals. And, there's the deal with genetics where small genetic differences may make for larger morphologic changes, right. Just depending. So, but I'm thinking to myself, from your perspective, right, it's like I would almost at that point rule out a Gigantopithecus ancestor, because that's so far removed. Like, to me, right. That would almost seem like you really want to pull back on Gigantopithecus and go more for Paranthropus. But even then, I would be like, all right, we're talking about what a potential common ancestor with maybe an Australopithecine, maybe a bit earlier, or Orin or something like that. I don't even think we've got that mapped out. I think it's just kind of sister group. It's kind of over there, right? So I'm thinking like, and while I think I would hesitantly say you're right. You definitely want to sequence more stuff to be sure, and it's very preliminary. There is always the chance that you're dealing with even a sampling error. Like it could be you want to go out there and get more samples. I don't know, and that's very far outside of my field. But that being said, I would think that if it's going to register a Neanderthal difference, it would register a Sasquatch difference.
You would think, but on the basis of, I mean, he only sequenced about 700 nucleotides is all. I mean, that's just that's not enough in my mind.
From one location, I would even argue that that's certainly not enough to rule it out. But at the same time, the Sasquatch deniers are fighting an uphill battle here, because precluding something is not as easy as providing support for something, or definitively precluding something, I should say.
So in any case, the anticipatory story here is that as I was fretting over this third possibility, the phone rings, and it's a geneticist who happens to be on vacation up in Yellowstone, and he's a new actually a visiting professor or postdoc at UC Davis.
Okay. Cool.
And pardon?
I said cool.
Yeah. And he was in the neighborhood, so he said, "Hey, I've always been a big fan, fascinated with the question." He said, "I'm passing through. Can I stop in and visit?" And I said, "Well, of course, if you'll let me pick your brain." And so he was another geneticist who concurred. "Oh yeah, you should be doing the entire mitochondrial genome and at least a dozen nuclear genes to boot to be confident." And he said, "You should talk to my professor." He said, "I studied in New Zealand. I'm from New Zealand." He said, "My professor, Neil Gemmell." And paused as if I should recognize that. Well, I'm not great with names, but it turns out, he goes, "Neil Gemmell, he was the lead investigator in the multinational study of the Loch Ness waters."
Oh, wow. The eDNA study. Yeah,
Yes.
I know the one with the eels.
Exactly. And I go, "Oh, this is perfect." I said, "Do you think, would you put me in contact with him?" He says, "Oh, absolutely. I'll introduce you." And so this was a year and a half ago, pre-COVID. And so Neil and I started going back and forth, dialoguing, and he got intrigued and is eager to undertake a project if I can come up with the lion's share of the funding for it. But then COVID hit.
Yeah.
And so everything got put on the back burner.
That's how it went forever. I know. Yeah. That sucks.
So over the winter, or over the summer and this coming winter, we're putting our heads together, and we're crafting a proposal to do a more extensive study of those nest sites for one, but also in other areas. I mean, I want to do some water sampling too, in areas where there have been recent reports, and be poised. Everyone keeps telling me, "Have you checked the your plaster cast? There could be actually DNA in the soil or attached to the plaster." Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's a stretch that anything has survived the handling and so forth to avoid contamination, especially given our previous discussion.
Right.
But fresh footprints, scoop up that soil and do analysis on that. So that I really do think, I'm really happy you brought that up, because I see that as the future direction. Going out and hoping that you find tracks, or hoping that you bump into a Sasquatch, or the idea that anyone's going to shoot one with a tranquilizer, I think is just is untenable. But finding their trace, it's still a very rare and elusive animal, but yet if you can get into areas that have a history, that have contemporary sightings, and be ready to jump on it, and then have the methodologies in place to collect samples.
I think that would be amazing. And in part, it's especially cool that it's the guy who did the
oh yeah, it's a little extra hook, you know.
Yeah, well, and that's really cool too, because it's if memory serves, and I actually, when I lived in the UK for 9 months prior to COVID for my MRes, and I took that opportunity to visit the Loch Ness in Jarmuth, which was really fun. And we went to the museum, and I was actually surprised by how cynical the museum was, but I really did enjoy it. And one of the things that they mentioned, about that eDNA study with the eels is that, most people there didn't even know there were eels in the loch. Most
really?
people didn't know that they existed in the loch. So the fact that they were catching this on the eDNA for something that most folks had just never even seen, I think that bodes really well for using it as a potential study for bolstering or eliminating certain lines of evidence or support for Sasquatch. I think that would probably tell you a lot. But you're going to get, I think you're also dealing with a much bigger area too, that it's like you're sweeping a lot of space there, and you kind of just got to hope that, something, assuming that the Sasquatch is a legitimate organism, is that it's passing through there.
Sure, that's right.
Which
I think it has to be focused. You can't, there's just no way. I mean, this is the challenge. I tell students too, I can't go out in the field and systematically collect evidence for or against Sasquatch, other than the absence of it. But, it's your chances of, it's not like you can just do a transect through the forest and see if you bump into a Sasquatch. It just doesn't work. And that's, there are methodologies for studying rare and elusive species that use other alternate techniques. But even those, I mean, they're animals like, wolverines or martens or fishers, that are probably still more numerous than Sasquatch, I would wager, but at least in some areas, not always. But anyway, yeah, it'll have to be a fairly focused study. But
so, do you think that, and this is what kind of alluding to one of my questions, because for me, it's my big two is that I'm not really as concerned with the lack of a body or things of that nature. I think there are a lot of organisms that are very difficult to find, and certainly you can't, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, I suppose, is how the saying goes.
Right.
But I do, I put my butt there, but I do find the fossil support, the paleoanthropologic stuff on that pathway, because I know you've suggested in the book and in prior conversations, there's this potential crossing of a land bridge, right, from Europe or Asia, one of these locations. I mean, or rafting for an organism this big might be a little difficult. So it's like, making it over via a land bridge. I'm thinking that given how organisms of this size tend to move, why is it that, because I guess I'm imagining that this range used to be a bit more expansive, and then, it's shrinking as human encroachment occurs and things like that. So why do you suppose we, with all the dinosaur dig sites and paleontology that occurs in the United States, why do you suppose we've not run into perhaps a remain, I guess? Right,
exactly. Well, obviously fossilization is extremely capricious, and the conditions need to be conducive. We discussed a little bit about the porcupine bias of the Gigantopithecus fossil record.
Right.
I mean, here is an ape that had a tenure of existence in East Asia for 1.5 million years, and yet we have to show for that 2 jaws and a few thousand isolated teeth, which isn't much at all. And nothing else. I mean, not a single other postcranial bone. It's just hard to imagine otherwise. But and you pointed out in your introduction, it was recently discovered of the first fossil of a gibbon, at least a radius, but if we had this conversation just a couple of years ago, we'd be saying, well, there are no fossils of gibbons.
Yeah,
so there's always discoveries. Discovery is an ongoing process, and especially in paleontology. Okay, so give me that. So likewise,
I'm with you on that. Taphonomy,
right.
I'm with you on that.
So what is Sasquatch? I mean, is it a Gigantopithecus extant, or is it something else? We would never have thought that there was a late Australopithecine, early Habeline in Southeast Asia until a few years ago.
Yeah.
And so that tells us that there is a huge gap in our understanding of the dispersal of those species from, I mean, the source presumably is Africa.
And I think that's a really good point. I want to add something, I guess, to that
Yep.
case, I suppose, because you're right. I mean, we're looking at places like Flores and I forget Luzon, I believe, or Luzonensis.
Luzonensis and
these early members of Homo, if we want to put them in Homo, which I know some folks are like, we got some basic stuff going on here, and I would agree with that. And I think that it's a great point that it's like, okay, we've got Habilins and Australopithecines chilling out, minding their own business in Africa, and then we've got them showing up in Flores, and we don't find them along the way, perhaps because we're not looking for them in those locations.
Right. Well,
I would suppose, though, the only pushback I would give on that is that unlike those areas that kind of dot that line up through kind of the Middle East and through Southeast Asia and then down, through the kind of Southeast Asian peninsula off into the islands out there, I think that we tend to we've developed areas of the United States along the pathway from, like, say, the Bering Strait or something along those lines, that would be more conducive to fossilization, because we've just got the absolute pleasure of having so many different kinds of biomes here in the States and in Canada and North America. So I guess I'm thinking, it's almost like we have been looking, and the areas that would have fossilized them either by sheer bad luck or because there wasn't one aren't fossilized. We aren't finding the remains there. Do you suppose maybe it was just because my immediate pushback on myself is like, okay, well, maybe they weren't there for very long. Like, what are your thoughts on the range upon arriving in North America?
Right. Well, we know that there were periods of time where the land bridge was contiguous forested habitat. So the forested habitats are not themselves going to be good, conducive environments for fossilization. And then, of course, there was more land exposed with the lowering of the sea level, which now is inundated. And so that's probably eliminated some other potential sources. I mean, the most likely place to find remains would be, in my mind, in limestone caves and along the western coastline. And it happens that there is someone, Tim Heaton is at the South Dakota School of Mines, I think I'm getting that right still, whose specialty is excavating Pleistocene deposits in limestone caves in southeastern Alaska. And he's excavated dozens of these caves now, all the way down to the bedrock. And so he's sampling hundreds of thousands of years. And yet, in all those excavations, he's got just a handful of bear fossils.
Right.
So he's saying, tens of thousands of bears have come and gone. But that's the representation we have. I posed this question to him. First of all, I said, have you ever come upon anything that even remotely resembled a primate? And he said, no, we haven't. And I said, assuming for just a moment, for the sake of argument, that there's a very real possibility that Sasquatch exists, would it surprise you that you haven't found fossils? And he said, oh, no, not at all. He said the preservation in these caves is so biased and so particular to and some particular in some instances to filtering and so forth, but also in some cases quite serendipitous, that it doesn't surprise me in the least that we haven't, especially something that may have only been on the continent for a few tens, if not hundreds of thousands of years. So I think they're fairly recent. I think they're potentially fairly recent interlopers. Now, what does that say for Asia? If they've had a longer tenure there, perhaps, as suggested by, their presence there is I think very real. I mean, the slam dunk evidence for me was when I was able to examine these footprint casts from Shenanjia, and they showed the remarkable pressure ridge, absolutely comparable to the examples here, especially the one from the Patterson-Gimlin film site.
That's a perfect lead-in, because I want to ask you about the trackways, because I know that's your bread and butter. That's your area of expertise, and I totally defer to you on that. And one thing, side note, I want to sorry, I totally interrupted you.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Made the point.
I just got excited because I was like, yes, I really wanted to ask you as I was reading your book, and I have a black and white copy, so it was difficult for me to make out like the proposed dermatoglyphs,
Right.
the ridges. And I found some of them quite compelling. I was looking at some of them, I was like, this is very interesting. This is quite strange. I don't have a ready explanation for it, which doesn't mean Sasquatch, but at the same time, I was like, I don't know what to make of this. And then some of them I was kind of like, I don't know, not my field. This is your area. So if you propose them, I'm sure that, you know what you're talking about. But to me, they almost looked like mud cracks or drying agents or things like that. The more cross-sectiony looking ones they had the less of the whorls and more of the cross hat almost.
Sure. Well, that what's in the book needs to be revised a little bit because some things became apparent after the book was published. There are some examples, and we had our suspicions, but it became, as we did some more experimentation, it became very, very evident. I had observed a phenomenon. We were doing some experiments with the transfer of dermatoglyphics to very fine substrates. We were actually trying to determine if indeed you could transfer pore details, the pores on the ridges, to these very fine substrates. And so we were experimenting with talcum powder and flour and loess from the soils around here, which are very similar to those in southeastern Washington, which also has a very high loess content that makes it's just so extremely fine. And yes, we could transfer that kind of detail. But in the process, we found as we were doing some of our experiments, when you would pour plaster, especially if it was about ready to kick, if it was just about ready to set up, if you poured it into this very dry substrate like the loess, it would suck that just enough moisture out to cause it to kick. And then it's just like if you've ever made pancakes on a hot griddle, right, and you're pouring the batter and it fries, it cooks, and then it overflows as you're pouring, and that cooks, and then the next, and you get these alternating bands.
Like hot magma almost, or lava.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that was, I think, happening in some of the examples that were taken in Northern California on a hot, dusty logging road. There was the superimposition of dermatoglyphics, or of dermatoglyphic-like features that were merely artifacts of using hot water to mix the plaster, which they caution you not to do. But they, it was just water that was sitting out in their water jug. That's all they had to work with. And then they were pouring that into this pulverized logging road dust that was sucking it out and causing this this alternating banding pattern, which was not real dermatoglyphics. In contrast, the example that I drew attention to in the book that had, which Grover had referred to it as wrinklefoot, because it had this very coarse dermatoglyphics, very extensive distribution, not just peripheralized as in these others from California. And in this case, it was under cold conditions, saturated soils, but the same lust, but now very clay because it's wet. And Officer Jimmy Chilcutt, the latent fingerprint examiner who came to my lab and examined these things, was especially impressed with these because there was clear evidence of healed scars that had interrupted the ridge pattern and caused kind of a herringbone, like taking a thread on a corduroy fabric and pulling on it. It causes this disruption in the pattern. He showed those. We took some latex peels of those features, and Jimmy had just finished a recertification workshop on specialized on focusing on scars as identifying characteristics in dermatoglyphics. Took him back to his instructor and showed him these, and he said, "Oh, yeah." He said, "That's textbook scar tissue, and those are real dermatoglyphics," not knowing where they came from.
Yeah.
But then he told him, and he was all the more intrigued rather than put off by it. So there was some qualification in that, and there was an investigator. Who was it now? I can't think of his name. He went by the moniker The Tube online, but I'm embarrassed now that I can't remember his name. But anyway, he had drawn some attention and did some experiments and showed how you could create artifacts. And he was right. I mean, he was right as it pertained to that particular set of examples. But we've had repeated examples that clearly show dermatoglyphics. And I think it's a real feature and to be expected. It's just extremely rare because you have to have precisely the right conditions to transfer the dermatoglyphics to the print. It has to survive long enough for someone to discover it, and then someone that has the wherewithal to pour the plaster. I mean, if it's a dry, dusty print, you pour plaster in that, it's pretty much going to obliterate it unless you consolidate it with a lacquer hairspray or something. And so in all my 300 plus footprint casts, there's only maybe a dozen that have even a trace of dermatoglyphics in them.
Right. And you mentioned it briefly. I want to make sure I was understanding you correctly. Is there a way to get dermatoglyphics without it could they be an artifact of something else?
Well, there's been a lot of debate about that. If you go into some of the old texts, they look at examples like submarine wave patterns in the sand. I mean, because it's not exactly clear what dictates. There's a certain genetic element, but then there are those who say that there's also a nature element that the conditions in utero actually cause the coalescence of the little papillae that form around the sweat pores that coalesce into the linear patterns. And so, when Chilcutt was first visiting with me and talking, he said there are characteristics, ending loop or ending lines, included lines, loops, swirls, and so forth, that determine that are the criteria by which he determines real print patterns. And he thought he could identify some of those characteristics in what we now think are artifactual features. So it's not as black and white, clear cut, an argument to be made. And so, the dermatoglyphics are one aspect, one interesting feature that may hold some interesting insights. They're restricted in their distribution and patterns to the point that they're not extremely informative about populations or about, other aspects. But when they're present, they're on footprints that display gross anatomy that is absolutely compelling. And even if the dermatoglyphics were gone, like the wrinkle foot, it's almost a distraction, because then people quibble over whether they're legitimate or not, or artifactual or real or factual. And the anatomy of the footprints itself is so compelling.
Right. Yeah. You're saying by looking at the dermatoglyphics, you almost miss the plot.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That actually leads me to a question that I want to ask. I alluded to this kind of in my presentation because, when I was looking at some of the pictures in the book, I noticed similarities between a lot of the footprints. Of course, you've always got this inline helix that's in line with the rest of the toes.
Right.
And typically they're, within, you had a great chart in there that was like, we've got this nice normal distribution of general sizes and dimensions of some of these feet. But I kind of wanted to ask you, because you alluded to this in the text, that a lot of these guys, in your experience from the casts that you've made, they appear to be very flat-footed.
Yes.
Does that, and I don't know very much about foot morphology, does that lend itself to the terrain that these guys are living in?
Well, terrain and the body size. I mean, the longitudinal arch is a fairly recent innovation in human evolution. Our immediate predecessor, Homo heidelbergensis, does have evidence. I had the privilege of examining the most complete fossil foot skeletons of a non-Neanderthal hominin, non-human, non-Neanderthal hominin, namely Homo heidelbergensis, the specimen, Laishu specimen in China. And it clearly has an arch, but it's a low arch in a very broad, robust foot compared to ours. Much more akin to Neanderthals. I mean, I think we and Neanderthals inherited an arched foot from that common ancestor, but we have then further modified the foot to a very gracile skeleton with a much more accentuated longitudinal arch and a shortening of the calcaneus. So the input to output ratio is a speed lever system rather than a power lever. And we have shortened our toes even more by comparison to Neanderthals. A Neanderthal foot has some distinctions. I mean, not just the robusticity of the skeleton, but their toes are a little bit longer on average, and their heel is noticeably longer on average, the heel bone. So anyway, back to your point, the Sasquatch has never evolved an arch, and given its massive size, it would not be advisable to concentrate plantar pressures beneath those points beneath the heel and the ball of the foot. So they distribute weight out over the entire foot. Grover Krantz actually did a really nice breakdown in his, where he tried to see, are the compressive forces per unit area of the sole of the Sasquatch foot comparable to those of human? You know, in other words, are they functionally comparable? And there's some, you know, it's not as straightforward as that. I mean, how do you account then for the arch? Do you take a footprint with just the contact surface of the human, which is what I think he did, you know, eliminating the parts of the sole that were not in contact with the substrate. But one thing he didn't include, and for that he accounted for the great breadth of the foot. And I think I discussed that thoroughly in the book too, where data has been collected of breadth to length ratios. And when you plot that against, you know, humans and Sasquatch, they're two separate clouds altogether.
Yeah, they do group uniquely. Yeah, I remember that as well. I remember what you were referring to.
And so that's interesting in and of itself. I mean, as a distinguishing characteristic, I think lends credibility to the sample. The other thing that Grover didn't bring up, though, is the behavioral aspect as well, how an animal that massive can tolerate those kind of compressive forces on the foot. And it's through the compliant gait. You mentioned how you were impressed with how Patty moves so fluidly and smoothly across that screen. Well, it's because she's walking as if we would walk with flexed hips and knees and ankles. And so you don't see this head bobbing as she's walking across. Well, that's what they call in biomechanic literature the Groucho walk. It kind of predates some of our younger listeners, but Groucho Marx, you know, his trademark with his little cigar or big cigar up here, he would bend way down and he would walk with very flexed legs. And so by doing that, it reduces ground reaction forces by as much as 20%. So if you've already got a flat, wide foot, you don't have a heel strike and a toe off. Instead, you walk with the foot tending to land rather flatly. So you immediately distribute weight over the entire surface instead of concentrating it under the heel and concentrating it at a peak when we push off through our toes. You combine that with a very compliant gait as well, and you can reduce those ground reaction forces down to where they're tolerable to the tissues. Now, the Sasquatch also, I think, has a substantial sole pad with fatty tissue. Not extreme, but it's bigger than ours. And that's evidenced by a number of examples, but one in particular, one footprint example where it stepped on a stone. And its sole pad was able to accommodate that projecting stone to a remarkable degree. Didn't just push it down into the ground.
Right. Do you because this is kind of like my working around kind of what I was thinking when I was reading, but I thought it was quite interesting. Like I really found that distribution, that normal distribution graph, fascinating.
Yeah.
Because my question was, when I was, you've seen these pictures, they float around of the Sasquatch feet, right? And they tend to be, when you see them out of context amongst one another, you just put it into Google Images, you see them. There's just an astounding variety.
Right.
The ones you can just pull off the cuff, right? Not to the ones necessarily that you find in your text, which I would absolutely say share more than what you would find just upon like a cursory Google search.
Yeah.
But my question, I guess, would be, and I'm kind of thinking as I go here, you've got this topography of a foot, right? That falls within a certain range to give you that normal distribution curve. Do you think, could you entertain the idea, I guess, that the reason that would be is because people have this cultural idea of what Bigfoot is, and then they've got this idea of a range of feet that are actually feasible to hoax, as it were? Or in your opinion, is it just too well done? The consistency, I suppose.
Right. Well, if we're talking about the length, the size dimensions first, then I would expect, if there was a preponderance of hoaxes, they would tend to be people who, as you said, would expect a Bigfoot to be at least this big,
A Bigfoot, right?
And so it would be a skewed distribution,
right?
Skewed away from those with a 16, 17-inch range. Instead we get that bell curve that suggests a biological population with a distribution of size across that population. If we're talking about shape, form, topography, then yeah, I mean, the same thing occurred to me. My cursory experience gave me the impression that every one looked kind of unique, and no two were the same. And I thought to myself, well, if these are real, if there's a real population out there, it must be very rare in order, for it to be as elusive and to be seen so infrequently. If they are as rare as I suspect they must be, then if tracks are found in a given area over a period of time, it should be one of a few individuals. We should see repeat appearances,
right,
of recognizable
individual members of that. Right. Okay. Right. I see what you're saying. Right. I actually think you mentioned that in the book too. You have 3 prints kind of in quick succession that are supposed to be from the same individual.
Yeah. And so I started looking for examples of that. Even Patty, people argued that she was never seen before or since. I mean, meaning her footprints were never seen before or since. But those people were not taking into account differences in substrate. Your footprint when you walk on a hard pan logging road with a thin layer of dust are going to look different than when you walk on a fine grained sandbar over dry or slightly moistened by the periodic rains of the time that day sand. And if you take those into account, I mean, if you just line up the imprints and line up the deepest point on the tips of the toe or the pads of the toes, the deepest point across the distal end of the foot, the central point of the heel, if you line up the tracks like that, then ignoring the slight variations due to expansion or lack of expansion of the soft tissues, they line up. And I showed dozens of examples of tracks that were 15 inches long that could easily be Patty's footprints from that region prior to and afterward.
You present one thing in the book that
maybe one more question from you, Erica.
Okay, sorry.
Then we'll go to Q&A.
Listen, I know Dr. Meldrum's going to get so many questions too from the audience. I know most of the questions are going to be from him. That happened last time, so I suspect I'm going to use that opportunity to actually use the restroom if that's okay. But I want to ask one question before we go, before we end, I guess, on the formal discussion, because you have one example in your book of this idea of you talk about the classic bare hind limb. It's got this kind of vaguely human-esque shape, hominid-esque shape, and you have this one picture of a bare hind limb that kind of had or front limb that then had the hind paw kind of step on the front half, and it gives almost this, over it, right? And you registered, yes, that's the word. How many do you think could actually be attributed to that kind of process? Not very many. Is that quite rare? Or
no, yeah, not very many, because and as I discuss in the book and as I illustrate in my field guide and so forth, there are very distinctive characteristics that whether it's the hind paw overstepping the forepaw or vice versa, or just coming up close to the forepaw, depending on the speed, there are features that stand out that distinguish those. And so I've not encountered a lot of examples where those have been mistaken. Most people are observant enough that they
Tell the difference.
pick up on that and can tell the difference.
Usually,
And,
I think they register nails as well quite frequently.
well, right, and that's not a foolproof. Some people will swear, oh, if there aren't claws, then it can't be a bear. Well, that's not true. I can show you examples, and people can educate themselves. You know, the marvel of the internet. You can Google bear tracks and create your own photographic archive of example after example, and start to and develop that search image and see the distinguishing characteristics. You can read the things that I've written. There are lots of sources of such information. It's not, I hate to diminish it, because there is a certain knack, but it's not rocket science.
Right.
You know, with just a little bit of training. I do workshops, and by the time these people come out of these hour workshops, they can tell the difference between a bear track and a human track and a Bigfoot track. You know?
Right.
So
okay, cool.
They're pretty straightforward.
Cool.
Okay.
So that was a blast. James, is it cool if I use the restroom while because I know the first question is going to be for him.
Sure,
that's right.
I'll be right back.
I want to remind you folks that our guests are linked in the description. We highly encourage you to check out their links, as we appreciate our guests very, very much. And so this one coming in from Chris Gammon, thanks so much, said for both. That's funny. That was the only one that actually said for both. So we'll jump back to that one. We've got
okay.
From Rory Borkman, thanks for your kind words. Says, thanks so much for hosting these debates. It's our pleasure. And folks, we pay the thank you forward to our guests, as they're the lifeblood of the channel. We appreciate them. And so again, they're linked below. Thanks, Rory. Harry White says, question for all three of you. Wow, that's funny. But we'll wait until Erica gets back. Sigifredo Sarabia, thank you for your question. For Dr. Meldrum, says, and sometimes these are a little bit challenging. Sigifredo likes to keep me on my toes. I think they're saying, if hominids branched away to make room for Bigfoot, where is Bigfoot's Yeti cousin? Where is your cutoff for evidence where Bigfoot's not subjected? I'm not sure.
I don't know if I can ferret out a sensible question from that, with all due respect. I don't know what he means by, I mean, we're talking about a very bushy hominoid tree, and many of those branches, the majority of them have, with the exception of, if we include the great apes and lesser apes, the radiation of gibbons and siamongs and the orangs and the chimps and gorillas. On the hominin side, presumably all other branches have gone extinct. But the question is, have they? I mean, we have more and more evidence accumulating of very recent persistence of a number of these species, like Homo floresiensis and Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals and even Homo erectus in Southeast Asia. I mean, the dates kind of, the opinions seem to vacillate, but there have been opinions as recently as 25,000 years ago, regardless of whether it's 25 or 75. They just dredged up a jaw which was attributed to Homo erectus off the coast of Taiwan and dated it to about 10,000 years ago. So between 10 and 30,000 years ago, there were a half a dozen different hominin species alive in East Asia. Why, in the face of so much interesting evidence suggesting there might be something still persistent, some relic hominoids, would we eliminate that possibility when that was the rule rather than the exception throughout all of the history of hominin evolution? Gotcha. So on that one, now as far as Yeti and as I suggested, these are separate branches, and there are different arguments to be made for or against each of those different types of relic hominoid. Honestly, the Yeti argument on the basis of footprints turns out to be extremely limited. I did an in-depth review of the footprint evidence attributed to the Yeti and boiled it down after eliminating the totally indeterminate, unintelligible, sublimated blobs. There was a large number of bears. There's obviously a lot of conflation in the lore and in the legend and fact about between bears and Yeti, bears and hominoids, that is, involving Yeti. It boiled down to two examples of potential hominoid. Well, two, maybe three. One is the Shipton footprint, which has its quirks and may be anomalous, which is unfortunate because it, but then there's which should be the poster child, the iconic footprint for the Yeti is the McNeely-Cronin expedition documentation of what looked like chimpanzee footprints in the snow. And then there was another book, a more obscure example by a man named Hutchinson, a journalist, a travel journalist, who witnessed what he thought were Yeti footprints. And they bear remarkable resemblance to the McNeely prints. And in fact, I've been encouraging him to write up some of his experiences for more recent consumption, more current consumption. Anyway, the point is there's he mentioned Yeti in there somewhere. I don't know if I addressed his question or not.
You got it. And it actually relates to another question, which is a fun one. Thank you, Luke Stevens, for your question. Asks, big fan of, thanks, by the way, for your kind words. Says, big fan of the channel. Appreciate it. And they said, question, Dr. Meldrum. So we did get to hear your thoughts on the Yeti, but they asked, do you believe in other cryptozoological creatures, such as the Loch Ness Monster or Megalodon in modern oceans, or Chupacabra?
Yeah. Well, I do, harbor an interest in cryptozoology. I am reluctant to allocate the study of Sasquatch to cryptozoology. I don't approach it as a cryptozoologist. I approach it as an anthropologist. Cryptozoology, unfortunately, has always struggled for legitimacy, and unfortunately, many of the cryptids are very dubious in nature. The Chupacabra, for example, again, my area is footprints, and so at one time a documentary crew came to the lab with in their opinion, a bona fide Chupacabra footprint. And so anticipating, based on the cursory description I was given, I lined up on the bench top footprint casts of wolves and a couple of large domestic dogs and coyotes and bobcats and puma. And out comes their cast, and it was very canine looking. And so, we just kind of moved the track up and down the scale. And I almost felt like going ding, 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 ding. But it was a domestic dog. In fact, it was identical. It was like a clone of my example of which was just a dog print that I cast up on the hillside where the people walk their dogs. And this one ran through the mud and it dried in a very pristine footprint. And so it was a great comparative example for my collection. And this could have been its twin sibling. It was so similar. So, there's just, you've got to go with the evidence and, qualified, objective evaluation of the eyewitness testimony. And unfortunately, there's a lot of the popular cryptids that don't hold up under scrutiny very well.
Gotcha. That's interesting. And another somewhat related question. This is for both of you. Actually, this one is Harry White. Thanks for your questions. So for all three of you, UFOs, what's going on? I don't know if they're meaning the most recent videos being released. Yeah. I'm actually a little bit behind, so I haven't really seen them. I really honestly have no idea on this question. So short and sweet, I'll kick it over to you. Erica, I guess we can start with, and then we'll kick it over to Dr. Meldrum.
Yeah, there's a couple of weird things on this world that we live on that I feel so out of my depth to even comment on. I mean, I see some of the stuff that they put out there of these, crafts or whatever, and it looks like a balloon. And then, you see others, they're from someone who's, in the Navy or whatever, and a bunch of them saw something strange. And I find it particularly compelling when large groups of people simply say that, like, we saw something weird and we don't know what it is. And isn't that what an unidentified flying object is? So I give that one, UFOs, a hearty I have no idea what's going on there, and I will leave that to the folks that have even a clue of how, aerodynamics and non-ballistic/ballistic motion works. So I'm just going to leave that one to them. It is interesting that the Pentagon was talking about it recently, though. That is kind of funny. I'm not sure what to make of that.
Right. Well, and the report is due out here in a couple of weeks. If not, I don't know what the date in June, but sometime in June, the report is supposed to be released, and those supposedly in the know keep saying that their sources are telling them this is going to be a real serious announcement, and that there are the official term is not UFO, it's UAP.
Yeah,
unknown aerial phenomenon.
Well, there's it's very funny to me, it's really easy, and I think that this applies to the Bigfoot stuff too. It's very easy to see a bad example and write every subsequent example off as something similar. Right. But I think it's important, whether or not UFOs and Sasquatch both do or don't exist, it's important to, appreciate everything in and of itself, and then also with the preponderance of everything that you've got. And I do find it very interesting that the at least here in the United States, the government keeps doing this thing where they're like, UFOs are fake. We don't, we're not doing anything with them. And then 10 years later, they had some, project where they were looking into them. And then you're kind of just like, hey, why then? If there's nothing going on. I mean, and maybe it could be as simple as some other countries got way cooler toys than we do. It could be as simple as that. But who knows?
Yeah, it is. I would just add that regardless of the outcome, it won't necessarily draw a line connecting two dots between Sasquatch and UFOs, and that's been suggested by many repeatedly over the years. And I've never seen anything to substantiate that kind of connection. Any more than the bear that you see in your backyard when you happen to see a UFO overhead. It didn't come from the UFO, almost assuredly.
I've seen some bonkers stuff out there about that, because as someone who's also involved in anthropology and primatology, like engaging with this idea that there are undiscovered animals in this world of ours, which there most certainly are. What those animals look like is to be determined, right? But that's a completely different story than Sasquatch is an interdimensional being, man, and like he took me up in his shit, dude. It was awesome. It's just like those are two different conversations.
I always say those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and I try to be open-minded, and I have accepted invitations to come out to areas where such phenomenon are supposedly transpiring, only to be unfortunately disappointed. I pressed one gentleman who was just adamant that he had witnessed orbs and did witness them repeatedly. And I said, well, have you ever snapped pictures of them? Oh, yes. Well, can you send me your best example? So he did. He sent me a scan of one of his photos. It was a night shot with a flash camera through the pollen that was coming down.
Oh,
each of these reflective pieces of pollen was an orb. And I've experienced that myself. I was in Colorado when the ponderosa pines were just pollen was blowing everywhere. And when you'd go out of the trailer to go out to your tent and you turn on your headlamp, you couldn't see. It was like a whiteout because all you could see was this illuminated pollen blowing around. And if that's what people are equating with orbs, back to what are the data? Are we really talking about the same thing? And in many cases we're not. So
Yep.
That's funny. And this one coming in for both. Chris Gammon, thanks for your question, said, seems to me such a large animal with enough population to continue propagating would leave easily discoverable evidence of their existence. This has probably been kind of covered on and off throughout, but if you want to add anything, we'll give you a chance.
I'll add something. The notion of minimal viable population or minimum viable population is often brought up. There have to be enough to reproduce. But if you do a little research, even just Google minimum viable population and see what Wikipedia has to say, there's a pretty interesting little entry, and it acknowledges that that's a concept that's really nebulous. And the only way to really, the the concern there is, as to what constitutes a minimum viable population, is what's the genetic load? Because if you have inbreeding, then you have a tendency for deleterious recessive alleles to combine and crop up, right? So the more presence of deleterious mutations in a population, the larger the gene pool needs to be to avoid those homozygous recessives from cropping up. And so the only way to know then what is the minimum viable population for a species is to do extensive genetic testing, which isn't done except in rare occasions.
To your credit there too, one of my colleagues from my MRS program, or a colleague now, I suppose, she came and spoke at our program. She works with the Hainan Gibbon populations on the island of Hainan, and there's 30 odd individuals left of that entire species.
Right.
And they've done some work genetically, and because there's two very small but genetically distinct populations, they might just be able to bring this species back. It's iffy. But I mean, 30 individuals, that's pretty small. And you've got inbreeding issues, of course, and they're going to be extremely vulnerable to disease and unless we intervene, I guess, genetically or whatever. But viable populations, that is a variable game to play. Right.
And so I was going to add to that example of yours, mountain gorillas went down through a bottleneck where there were less than 200.
Yeah.
And they are on the rebound now. There's just under 1,000, and they have been genetically studied. And it resulted in a paper that described that some species have adapted to bottlenecks and fluctuations in population numbers, and their gene pool is pretty darn clean. It may be that your gibbons rebound, and then over time they will accumulate variation that naturally occurs without any genetic intervention. But natural selection has actually produced these populations. So if you go to that Wikipedia entry, what they give is kind of a rule of thumb for vertebrate species. What a broad category, huh? Vertebrate species, 1,000 individuals is probably a minimum rule of thumb. Well, if we've got 3,000, 2,000 in North America, that's far exceeds the minimum viable population rule of thumb. And so I don't think you can resort to that argument to say there would have to be enough that they would naturally leave sign that you're just going to stumble upon. I mean, we've got 35,000 black bear in Idaho. Go for a hike in Idaho. You're not going to stumble upon signs of black bear everywhere you go. I've only seen black bear in the wild and I'll exclude sightings in the national park, but only twice in all the time I've spent in the field. I found tracks. I've found some sign, scratch marks, foraging signs, but I've only seen a black bear twice. So, I think we overestimate our ability to keep our finger on the pulse of every species that's out there.
Super interesting. Thanks so much. And then this one coming in from Sigifredo Sarabia for Erica says, what limitations in evolutionary theory conclude hominids were the exclusive choice for the modern human while discriminating against Bigfoot? I don't know if I understand that, but maybe you do.
I don't think I claimed that there were any. I mean, the idea that your anatomically modern humans descend from hominids is supported by just about every line of evidence that you can have. I mean, you've got biogeographic support for this, out of Africa, Ethiopia-ish location. Of course, the genetic similarity of humans to the rest of the great apes, and very specifically to chimpanzees, who themselves have this nice biogeographic support for a common ancestor right around the East African Rift, right around that location. And that's kind of why the question of Bigfoot is very interesting to me, because I've always thought that it seems very paranthropine in nature to me, which is a sister group to the Australopithecines. And this organism differs from the Australopithecines in that it's got these huge megadont molars, a nutcracker man. Oh, he's got these molars that are 4 times the size of an adult human, and yet they are physically shorter, smaller, quote unquote, than your average anatomically modern Homo sapiens, which is really interesting because these guys just spent all their time, grinding these teeth of theirs as they ate hard foodstuffs. And they had these big, beautiful sagittal crests on the tops of their heads, and were probably just fascinating, orthognathic, weird-looking faces in comparison to the Australopithecines. They're just highly specialized. And to me, I always thought that it seemed I guess, like a natural link, sort of, if you will. Mm-hmm. But I can entertain Gigantopithecus as well. I think it's just harder because of our preconceptions as folks in primatology and anthropology, because Gigantopithecus is so typically depicted as this massive quadrupedal orang, which is almost a little bit funny. To Jeffrey Meldrum's credit, it is a little bit funny because orangutans are arboreal. These guys aren't like hanging around knuckle walking all the time. Their poor little back feet are inward turned because they're so suspensory adapted.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, it's also quite a bit easier to draw the lineage with humans because humans, there are a ton of us. There's so much to work with humans as far as what that lineage looks like, and how we make those connections.
Gotcha, thanks. And this one, we'll read these two together because somebody sent in an answer, a possible answer to the question before the question came in. So the question is this: Barman G, thank you for your question, said, Amy Newman, thank you for your question, said, after show on this topic at my channel, and folks, want to let you know, after shows are linked in the description, as well as the question is for Dr. Meldrum: why do Bigfoots seem both massive and stealthy? Doesn't that mixture seem almost like an oxymoron to be massive and stealthy? And then someone else said, Actual Socialist Trash, love that name, says, in Doctor Who, Peter Capaldi in the episode Listen wonders about an animal that has adapted perfectly to stealth. Could this be Bigfoot? In other words, this kind of radical adaptation in the stealth direction. But anyway, I thank you for that, Actual Socialist Trash. And the question again from Amy is kind of seems, Amy suggests, maybe strange that it could be both so huge and yet stealthy.
Well, actually, that's not incongruous at all. And there are many examples you can point to. The forest elephant. You talk to people who have been out and observed the forest elephant. You can be 15 feet away from the elephant in that dense forest and not see it, not know exactly where it's at. You can hear it maybe, but there's a good book. Garrett Patterson has just written an excellent book about elephants, sort of a relic population of elephants in South Africa. And he also mentions their traditions about a relic hominoid in Africa. One of the few, it may be a relic Australopithecine, who knows, but stories about it. But it illustrates, his efforts to track these elephants we're talking about, and their elusivity. I mean, basically the only way they keep track of them is when they cross the roads, and they can identify them by the diameter of their footprints or any distinguishing marks or scars on the footprints.
To your credit on that one, and I'm the skeptic side of this, but my skepticism from Bigfoot mostly comes from like the things we discussed earlier, fossil record fatalism and stuff like that. But as to that point about big things being sneaky, I've been around a couple of wild primates. One was chimpanzees, and they can sneak up on you very easily, and you really don't want to get sunk up by a chimp. But almost in a more interesting fashion was when I was doing field work in Thailand. We were out in the middle of nowhere checking camera game traps in this forest, and almost instantly we looked up, and you could look all around, and anywhere you looked, essentially there was a pig-tailed macaque. It was a colony of about 90 of them, and they came almost dead, like almost silently, like you almost noticed them because you sat up and you were like, wait a second, and then you can see them in the brush. These guys aren't small. I mean, the cats can get pretty big. The males are intimidating. They're large animals. And just as quickly as they came, they bailed out. They were just passing through, and they were kind of like, what are these weird, animals doing in our zone? Where a French primatologist was there studying them, and she was like, oh, you saw them? And we were like, yeah, we saw them out there. And she was like, I've been trying to find them all day. That goes to show even big animals that live in massive groups can be kind of sneaky. I mean, I think that there's reasons to be skeptical, but I don't know that big things can't be sneaky to be one of them.
Right.
Super interesting. And thank you for your question. Now, Baron Von G, appreciate it, said, all I'm going to say is if Bigfoot was here, wouldn't we at least find its teeth in particular? And if we haven't, they're kind of worried. Is there? I'm new to like fossilization, or maybe this would be not fossilization, but preservation of just remains. Uh, Teeth, are they special in that are they well preserved usually compared to everything else?
The enamel, yeah, the enamel makes them particularly robust.
Oh,
right. So they're already half fossilized. The amount of material to be replaced by mineralization is much smaller. So they can survive being bounced around in a stream or buried in the sediments of a cave or whatever.
that's super interesting.
So, well, and it goes back. We've discussed this quite a bit. The capriciousness, the serendipity of fossilization is often underappreciated because we hear so many discoveries of fossils, but it's a fraction of not only the number, the individuals of a species, but a fraction of the species. I mean, there have been studies done comparing modern communities of various taxa with their paleo communities as represented in the fossil record. And if we can use the modern diversity as kind of a gauge for what we might expect to be, by approximation in these paleo environments, there was one study done by Bob Martin on, directed to primates, but it used other examples of other vertebrates. And they estimated that the primate fossil record right now only samples about 8% of the taxonomic diversity that actually existed in the past. 8%. I mean, even, when you talk about hominin diversity, if obviously when we're comparing monkeys to hominins, the natural history variables might be sufficient to say, well, that's far too conservative or liberal an estimate. Even if you doubled it or tripled it or quadrupled it, we've still only measuring 32%, 1/3 of the actual diversity of hominins that were out there, and yet to be discovered.
It's especially kind of to that point. I mean, most of the excellently preserved hominins that we have, and hominids and hominoids that we have, I mean, really, you can go all the way back to all of the great primate preservations that we have, are excellent luck. Your MH1 and MH2 Australopithecus sediba, you've got nice preservation there, but by sheer chance almost. Same with some of our hominins that tend to fall into, big pits or get carried by predators into caves, or in the case of Oreopithecus, we've got the coal miner ape, it's again fallen into some pit and been preserved there. I think it's notable that we get massive communities of primates that live in enormous groups of the likes of Mandrillus sphinx or Mandrillus leucophaius, or the likes of our baboons or macaques, live in huge groups. And it's not like you're walking around where they live and you're finding teeth all over the place. That being said, I put a huge asterisk on there because my skepticism more comes from a place of like, okay, but we do know that when a large animal lives in a place, especially if it's still living, we do tend to pick up traces of it in more tangible ways, I would almost suppose. And for me, it's always going to be like the fact that we do have all of these hominins in these locations that they're better, of course, than the United States as far as your preservation goes. But even in like the Miocene Europe, we're still finding critters turning up, decent, Hispanopithecus, things of that nature, even like Luphapithecus, like getting over into more tropical areas. And so what I'm dying for is like, where's our Sasquatch? Where is it? Our one excellently preserved, this poor fella fell into a pit, when right after the Bering Strait, and here it is. That would be superb.
That would be. I would point out notably too that many of these species that we have, the taxon is represented by a single individual, or just a couple of individuals. And so, every once in a while, a new fossil is discovered. I mean, the pace of discovery has continued almost unabated. And so it may just be a matter of time when that.
I hope you're right.
I hope so too. You know.
I really do, because I would love it. I really would.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then this one, combining these two, Throw the Dwarf of the House. Thanks for your question. Said, I never jumped the fence so much on a subject. And Ned said, do you think that Bigfoot is intelligent enough to be making the choice to keep away from humankind for its own safety? Could it be that it is actively hiding?
Well, most wild, that's the definition of wild animals, isn't it? You don't have to have hominin level intelligence to whether by conscious choice or instinct, avoid human interaction. That's what the art of hunting is all about. These big bucks that have racks that suggest that they've survived dozens of hunting seasons. How do you think they do that? It's not just dumb luck. They intentionally avoid. They seem to know when the hunting season begins, and they avoid every area. I read this story one time. This guy actually observed this. He wasn't a hunter, but he was a keen observer of nature. And there was this little grove of trees in the center of a highway turnabout. And he said every fall, this buck would disappear into that grove of trees, only to reemerge about 4 weeks later when the hunting season was over. And he never got shot, So I don't think you have to invoke extraordinary intelligence to explain behaviors that are typical of just about every form of wildlife.
Interesting. And then folks want to remind you, or I should say let you know for the first time, if you happen to send a super sticker or a joke or anything like that in a super chat about my feet or anything like that, I will read it in the post-credits scene. So I just want to respect the time of our guests. So I promise I'll read those. But as in terms of sticking to the serious questions so that we can get our guests out of here at a decent time, I'm going to go to the next one. Farron Salas says, is it presumed that Bigfoot's laryngeal nerve takes the same absurd path through the body like in humans or giraffes? Thank you to the debaters. And James. Thanks, Farron. You guys know about this laryngeal path?
Yeah, it's the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which is a branch of the vagus nerve, and it takes a route that, in fish, it crosses one of the branchial arches, which in us is the aorta, and so it as the heart has dropped into the thorax, it's drawn with it this nerve, so it takes this circuitous route. Instead of going from the base of the skull to the intrinsic muscles of the larynx, it drops clear down around the aorta and back up. What's his name? Terrible with names tonight. The famous evolutionist actually recreated a demonstration that was first done by Darwin, where they dissected a giraffe to demonstrate the even more ridiculous path followed by this nerve up and down the entire length of the giraffe. It's
a classic like dunk on folks who like to bring up bad design, right? It's a young Earth creationist / ID dunk, which I might have brought that upon us because I debate so many creationists.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins, that was who I was trying to think.
Richard Dawkins, yeah. Right.
If you Google Richard Dawkins and recurrent laryngeal nerve, there's a great little video clip that shows this dissection. But I would just say, since we have that arrangement, since all vertebrates do, and every grade 8 that I know of has that, then it stands to reason that would be the arrangement in Bigfoot as well.
Interesting.
If it doesn't, maybe it did come from a UFO.
Yeah, that would be that'd be your great proof for that. Right. Like proof of the interdimensional Sasquatch traveler. No laryngeal nerve. No laryngeal nerve. Just
speak, communicate by telepathy.
Right.
Super interesting. And then EndoXD, thanks for your question, said, thoughts on Bigfoot videos? Are they convincing? And I know this did come up a bit, but I'll give you a chance to respond. Go ahead. If you want to add anything other than what was already said.
Well, we concentrated on the Patterson-Gimlin film, which is head and shoulders above anything else. There are a few other ones there. In my book, I talk a little bit about the Freeman footage.
Is it Memorial Day?
And the Memorial Day, which is a different one. The Freeman footage is quite compelling, and for a number of reasons. But there's a long litany of various videos clips, usually just short little snippets, nowhere near the 60 seconds of, the whole 60 seconds of the Patterson-Gimlin film. There used to be a website, a Facebook page, I don't know if it's there anymore. It was called Facebook Find Bigfoot. And to his credit, he would invite the submission and evaluate them, and he would develop a set of criteria by which he sort of ranked their potential credibility. And it was interesting when you looked at just a run of his top 20, anyone by itself was pretty ambiguous, and but when you saw the pattern that were repeated over and over, the set of the head on the shoulders, the way it forward lean, the way the arms swung, the compliant gait, the high lifting of the feet, which would show up not consistently in all of them, but little snippets here and there scattered throughout. It made a kind of compelling case that there was this remarkable undercurrent of consistency to these little glimpses, and maybe there was something to it. But it also is a dramatic demonstration that most people are terrible photographers, and most of a lot of the clips were photobombs. They were shooting something else, and Bigfoot happened to get up and walk out of frame or walk across the frame or something on the horizon, and very few of them were intentional videos of Bigfoot.
Really interesting. And thank you for that, as well as thanks for this question coming in from Raw Nakedness. Says there is a very small population of Sumatran orangutans with
Sumatran orangutans,
with high genetic diversity, only 7,000 individuals.
Yeah. I mean, the interesting thing about Pongo, the genus Pongo, is that you got these guys separated on several different islands. They used to find them on the mainland too, in Malaysia, but not anymore, at least that we know of, or not typically, anyways. But the interesting thing is there are unique differences, behavioral, cultural, if you will, and morphologically between the different populations and different species. I should say different species and different populations even on some of these islands. Particularly the main difference between the Bornean and Sumatran orangutan, which is very interesting, is the Sumatran one spends much more time up in the trees than the Bornean one does, because they're still tigers on Sumatra. So they think that perhaps it's this retained fear of, oh my gosh, like there actually is something that could take us out here other than people. And so they stick to the trees. So, but yeah, orang anecdote there. I just think they're cool.
Yeah.
Interesting. And this one coming in from Cole Beasley says, you can Google Okay, I'll read that one later. The next one, Harry White says, Erica, if you were in the woods hunting and you saw a Bigfoot and you had one chance to shoot it before it disappeared, would you?
Yeah, I saw that one pop up in the side chat. I don't think I could do it. I really don't think I could. I mean, and I know Dr. Meldrum is probably like, oh my God, we'd finally have like legit support. I don't think I could do it. I really don't.
No, I couldn't as well. That was Dr. Krantz's and John Green's position. Krantz argued, that it was justified in order to establish the existence and recognition, and then if they required protection, then that would be forthcoming. But this will sound silly, but I had my reversal in thinking occurred because I wrestled with that ethical question and convinced myself, as Krantz did, that it was necessary. And when I first began doing field work, we were prepared, and we were our intention was, if the opportunity presented itself, to do that. But then I'd taken the kids to go see the animated Tarzan movie, and there were these two characters. One was Clayton, the safari leader, who shot at everything that moved. And of course, he wanted to capture and exploit the gorillas. And then there was the doting professor, who was willing in the end to give up his entire career and his way of life in order to live with and study these magnificent creatures. And I had this little voice in the back of my head said, Jeff, which of these characters do you emulate right now? And that was the moment of introspection that caused me to say, well, what is my motivation? I don't need to prove anything to anybody. And so my goal is to learn and study, and we can accomplish that through the recognition. We can, as a test case, if nothing else, through DNA. And there is actually a growing literature of arguing for the fact that, especially in cases of rare and endangered species, that we should be satisfied with a voucher DNA specimen rather than requiring the conventional, traditional type specimen to be lethally collected and stuffed in some museum drawer. So yeah, that's my approach now. And no, I would not. I don't think I'd even be tempted. I hope I wouldn't be tempted. There's a lot of motivation there, but I think I've come to terms with what it is I'm motivated by, and it's just to learn and to understand better.
That's awesome.
I'm not doing this, I don't do this to try to garner converts. I'm not proselytizing a belief. I'm arguing the evidence. I mean, my one argument, my principal argument, is that the evidence is sufficient that we should be studying this question, not dismissing it. It galls me that when people like Michael Shermer says the science starts when you have a body. That is the most inane, unscientific statement anybody can make. The science starts, listen to me, the science starts when you have a question. That's when science begins, when you start to methodically collect observations and experimentation to understand and address and answer a question. And if you wait until there's a body, you ain't a scientist, period.
You got it. Thank you very much. And this one coming in from Best in Show says, I think this is for you, Dr. Meldrum. They said, when visual sightings occur, wouldn't you expect Mrs. Bigfoot and Junior to be nearby? Why are the Bigfoots sighted alone so often?
Well, I think they're solitary. I think that's their adaptation. You could ask why do orangutans choose to stay alone? I mean, it's their adaptation of social structure. We do have numerous accounts of footprint trackways of females with offspring in tow. Even when Patty was filmed, as was pointed out, the motivation for going down there was that there were tracks that were identified, and they weren't just hers, I believe, but she was in company with a 13-inch footprint set and an 11-inch. And I think those were young adults that were still hanging out with mom. She may even have had a babe in arms. It's been suggested that those breasts you see look like they're in postpartum engorgement, like she's nursing, and she may have recently given birth. And so yes, there are, it's not unusual for a species to be solitary, but there are also ample sightings of what have been taken to be females, as evidenced by the breasts, and or the presence of offspring. The Memorial Day footage that's described in my book is almost certainly a female. It only stands about 5'7" tall, and when she's running down the hill, she has something on her back. And as she's running, that thing on her back starts to slip. And you see her, you actually see what looks like a little leg dangle down. And then her arm, instead of running like this, she suddenly swings one of her arms behind and clutches something to her. And then she disappears onto a flat spot on top of the knoll. When she reappears in camera sight, suddenly she gets 5 inches taller, which was measured by the photogrammetrist that analyzed the whole scene. But it looks like a little infant has climbed up onto her shoulders and has his head sitting on top of hers as she walks away into the tree line. I mean, it's the most natural and spontaneous looking thing. You can see her breasts, and as she's running, the breast tissues gyrating in a very natural fashion, and it is what it is. I mean, you can say it's not, but it's a very.
I liked that choice of. I liked that word usage a lot.
You like which one a lot?
Gyrating.
Gyrating.
That just
not just jiggling. They were gyrating.
Made me laugh. Made me laugh a little.
Next up, thanks for your question as well. Brainbug says, what are the interlocutor's thoughts on is it pronounced Mayaka ape?
Oh, yeah. In short, the photo of the Mayaka ape is a Ripley's Believe It or Not Museum exhibit. And you can find various iterations, slightly different pelage colors, slightly different vegetation, but it's a mannequin. And that's another one of the things that irritates me, is that it continually, even though we demonstrated that previously, and I had a friend who sent me a picture taken in a Ripley's museum, and it's but it gets all kinds of traction. I mean, the only other alternative is that it's an escaped orangutan. But it would be a bizarre looking orangutan.
Yeah, I had to look it up real fast, but that's a classic one that does go around a lot. And particularly if that's an escaped orangutan. I've never seen something with pelage like that. I'm also inclined to I've heard the Ripley stuff as well, and that one, yeah, it seems pretty cut and dry. Yeah.
I mean, the report was an anonymous letter to a local police station. The circumstances around it are very questionable to begin with, but then once you see the exhibit, it's slam dunk.
Mm-hmm.
Super interesting. And let me check. Oh, that is it for our questions. Want to remind you folks, our guests are linked in the description. We really appreciate them, folks. And so please do check out their links. This has honestly we've gotten so much positive feedback. I hope you guys know that, seriously, people really enjoy this. And so thank you, Dr. Meldrum. Thank you, Erica. It has been a true
This
pleasure.
was a blast, honestly. I've been looking forward to this all week, because I actually reread, I'd read your book before, but I reread over some of kind of the highlights. I went over some of the chapters that I remember really enjoying, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be great. Like, I had my list of questions, all the stuff I want to talk about. It was very fun, very enjoyable, very fun for me.
Well, likewise as well. I always find it invigorating to have especially an intelligent conversation with someone that can appreciate the arguments and not react emotionally. So it's been a lot of fun. Your command of the disciplines that you're involved with is also very, very admirable. Speaking as one whose memories are beginning to age, and
that's a huge, enormous compliment. I see my PhD in the fall, so that's just great to hear.
Yeah, well, congratulations. Yeah, good deal.
Gotcha. And want to say, yes, folks, they're linked to the description. I'll be back in a moment with a post-credit scene giving you updates about upcoming debates that you don't want to miss, folks. As, for example, you'll see at the bottom right of your screen, a juicy debate that is, I don't know if you guys know this. I was surprised. Someone told me, my friend Andy reached out to me, and he reads just constantly. He knows what's going on the internet. Apparently, the JFK assassination question is like really popular in some circles on the internet right now. And so really we're like, well, hey, we'll give it a shot, as well as we've got some juicy political ones next week as well that you don't want to miss. But I'll be back in a moment with more news on those. And so thanks one last time to Erica and Dr. Meldrum. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you.
ladies and gentlemen, that was so fun. I honestly enjoyed that so much. I can't believe, holy smokes, it's almost 3 hours. I just enjoyed that so much. We didn't get into the Q&A until pretty late. And I promised I would read those super chats. I'm sorry, folks, that we did not get to read some of your super chats on air. Or, well, we will read them on air, but some of them, like the super stickers and stuff, I saved them for the post credits because I knew that you want them read. And even though forgive me for, I just want to be sure we can get the debaters out of here on time, as we really do. We appreciate them so much. And so I'm excited to say hello to you in the chat. But first, I do want to read those super chats that came in from people. We do appreciate it. Thanks so much for your support of the channel, folks. Chris, thanks for your super sticker. Do appreciate it. As well as, I don't know if it was a super sticker or a question. I didn't see a question attached to it, though, just so you know, if you didn't know. NOXD, also, thanks for your super chat, says, who would win in a fight, 6 Bruce Lees or a gorilla with a brown belt in karate? And 2 of the Bruce Lees have nunchucks. Bruce Lees, let me do the math here. 2 of them have nunchucks. Gorilla. Yeah, I kind of think it'll still be the gorilla. If they're anything like deer, man, it's amazing. Sometimes you see a deer just get smoked by a car, and they keep running. It's just crazy. It's just not like a human where it would be like, boom, and it hits the ground. It's amazing how hard their heads must be. But anyway, let's see. NOXD, thanks for your question. And Woody says, I think Bigfoot is James Coons. Show us your feet. It's true. I do have... They're like relatively big feet, and more importantly, they're very hairy. It's like hobbit feet, just disgraceful. You don't want to see these. I mean, I know some of you do because you're sick, but I am pumped, you guys, and thanks. Gosh, since we're in the neighborhood of sick topics, you sickos. Let's see. Cole Beasley, thanks for your super chat, says you can Google Bigfoot, P-O-R-N, because we're a family-friendly channel. We don't use the P word anymore. And I guarantee you'll be convinced they are real. Well, thank you, Cole, for letting us know about that. But yes, I don't know if we're really family friendly. You guys, we have some controversial debates coming up that I don't like for real. If we get our first strike this coming week, it might happen. But we did actually host this debate last time, and we got away with it without a strike. So the debate that I'm talking about, no, not the JFK. Even though the JFK conspiracy debate is mildly controversial and certainly a fun one, I am not talking about that one. Let me show you the one that I am talking about. I think you already know, right? The one that I actually am talking about is, of course, next week's Super STRAIGHT debate with Vosh and T-Jump. That is going to be juicy, folks. You don't want to miss it, and that is showing on your screen right now. So that one... oh, baby. Folks, that's going to be fun. It's going to be controversial. It's going to be a political debate, of course, and you don't want to miss it. So we're excited about that, and we hope you are too. As well as, whoa, we got Nephilim Free returning tomorrow to debate newcomer Dr. Wilson. Exciting to have Dr. Wilson on for the first time as he takes on Neph. And he's well-spoken. He's got his own YouTube channel, Dr. Wilson does. So it's going to be fun to have him on. We're excited about it. And good old Nephilim Free. It's been a while since we've had Neph on, but we hope he's doing well. He's my uncle. A lot of you guys didn't know that, but yeah. No, I'm kidding. You believed it for a second. But let me talk about all these interesting debates we've got coming up. You could say gyrating through the schedule. We're excited about these. But Aztec, thanks for coming by. Also, Dave Langer, thanks for being here. And then thanks so much for being here, Lockbeard. And let's see. Lockbeard, yeah, says, oh, I'm angry that people are reading about, so you were taking time to read about Squatch, P-O-R-N, when there are far better questions in chat. It's like, well, there are super chats, so I do want to say thanks to those people. So I don't know why it's like, I can't read that. But yeah, folks, and it is true. We do put like the super chats in order. We don't always. Sometimes we do get to read the standard questions from the chat, but we don't always. And some people, I remember Kaz was a guest moderator, and I love Kaz. Kaz did a fantastic job. And some people were like, Kaz, you didn't read my question. And it's like, I have to be honest. I have to be completely honest. Like, if we wanted to do this show where we just took questions from people who emailed them in or something, and we said, no, we're not taking them from chat, even if you put them in the chat. Like, for the people who get angry that we don't read their standard questions, especially for the people that abused Kaz that night, because Kaz is a great guy. I'm like, you're not entitled to have your question read. If it's a super chat, I'll say you are entitled, and that's why we've told people if they send in a super chat and we miss it, I'll send them the super chat, $2 or $5 or whatever. I'll send it back via Venmo or PayPal. That's something I'm very serious about that. So I do tell people, I say, email me. But I will tell you at the same time, we do try to read standard questions when we can. But for the people who sometimes, I remember they ripped into Kaz and they're like, oh man, yeah, Kaz, you're not going to read my question. It's like, Kaz doesn't owe you anything. Like, stop acting so entitled. You're like, honestly, it's gross when people act like that. So we try to read the standard questions, but if we have limited time, which a lot of times with the guests, we do have limited time. And so just want to let you know about that. So, man, when people complain about that, especially when they treated Kaz that way, and I want to let you know, though, I loved this. That person complained, and then like 20 people rebutted them and said, seriously? Like, you're that entitled? In the comments, I was so encouraged that modern day debate people are so positive, and they were sticking up for Kaz, and they were saying, hey, like, you're not entitled to have your question read. If Kaz missed your question from the chat, because Kaz I think he did read standard questions that night, but he just missed one, and so I was so encouraged that people stuck up for Kaz, and I was just like, that is awesome. And so, but we do appreciate all of your being with us. And then let's see, Raptor Crazy, thanks for coming by. But yeah, when I see a lot of times too, it's like, hey, we're a free channel. You can watch for free all you want. And so when it's like, we're providing, like, these are quality shows. I mean, I listen to these. I download a lot of our debates on the Modern Day Debate podcast because I mentioned that before, and I'll listen to them after because my attention is split during the debate, and I want to get to actually like hear what was going on because my attention was bouncing back between the live chat and the debate, and so I don't always get to enjoy the debate while it's happening. And I know that nonetheless there are people out there that, even though I'm like attention split between OBS, the actual dialogue, and the chat, there's like that 1% out there who are like, and Jameson, you also have to read my question, even though I'm enjoying this debate and I don't have to go download it on my podcast after and listen to it because I get to put my full attention into it for no cost at all. But so that's my thing. 99% of you are positive, but I'm just so amazed at some of the people who will complain about something that's free, and they're so entitled to it. It's honestly, it's just disgusting, and it's like, they're so weak-kneed and pathetic that I just can't get over it in terms of like. They're the kind of people. But Kaz did a phenomenal job that night. Carissa always does a phenomenal job. Erica has always done a phenomenal job. She's been a moderator here before. And also, you guessed it, Converse Contender and Praise. You got to hand it to him. Praise has jumped in a lot of the time on short notice. I'm like, bro, I'm going to like seriously, just too much homework, save me. And he's like, I'll totally moderate, man. So I love Praise. I'm teasing him. I love him. But Orthodox Moore says, Apostate Prophet said he was looking for a Muslim to debate. Quote, is Islam true? I'm down to take that 100%. I'm open to it. I got to be, let's see, shoot me an email at moderndaydebate@gmail.com. We can try to figure out specifics on it. I know he's got a debate set up for June 9th, but if he's up for another one before that or after, I'm willing to host it. I would say, though, that like, he's probably looking for he's probably looking for like one of the more orthodox types of Islam to debate. And so, depending on what your version of Islam is, it's kind of like, I know you're not like this, but there's some people who are like, I'm a theologian, like I'm a Christian and I'm a theologian and I don't believe in God. And I'm like, I don't like have any animosity toward those people, but I'm kind of like, okay, I don't know if I want to call you a Christian. Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, if I just don't feel compelled to use other people's definitions sometimes. But long story short, you may not be an atheist Muslim, but let me know. Email, we'll talk, and we'll see if you're kind of if you have the view that he'd be into debating. But Tony, thanks for coming by. I see you in the old live chat. And Gutsick Gibbon, good to see you. And Sideshow Nav, good to see you there as well. Thanks, Hannah Anderson, for all of your huge support. YouTube Surgeon General, glad you were here and made it. Says, mini non sequitur show crowd in here. Love it. It is. Wow. This is like YouTube Surgeon General, Hannah Anderson, Heat Shield, Riley S., Dave Langer. Holy smokes. It's almost like It is crazy similar to the old gang at the Non Sequitur show. I'm sure some of you others had watched the Non Sec show. Mark Reed, good to see you. And Amanda, thanks for being with us, as well as in Haxed, glad you're here. And then Riley S. Good to see you again, Riley. I remember there was a time where we didn't get to see you, but we're glad you're back. And then NWC says, is that Matt debate going to happen? Believe me, and thanks for reminding me, I almost forgot. Believe me, folks, this is going to happen. So let me show you this upcoming debate. And folks, we are absolutely thrilled about it. Check this out on the bottom right of your screen. We're over 50%. We're over 50%. And folks, the cool thing is that, like, you guys, this is phenomenal. So we're ahead of schedule compared to where we were for the last Kickstarter. So that's encouraging. Believe me. So how this works, folks, is we're doing a crowdfund in order to raise the honorariums for our guests, as we do appreciate Dr. Kenny Rose and Matt Dillahunty, as they're putting in a lot of prep time for this debate, and also, of course, the debate time itself. But we do appreciate them. And, as an example, I mean, folks, we, just from Matt Dillahunty debates alone, I would guess we've probably had literally thousands of our subscribers have come from Matt Dillahunty debates. I would guess like it could be as high as, like, this is probably a liberal estimate, maybe even like 5,000 of our 46,000 have come from Matt debates. For real. I mean, Matt has helped us a ton. And so, yeah, long story short, we're raising funds through this crowdfund at Indiegogo, which is linked in the description. And I got to tell you, folks, look at this. Far right of your screen, that is the meter. We are at, I think it's 52% right now. And folks, on this Friday night, we only have 14 days left. So it doesn't close the next Friday, but the one after. It'll close the day before the actual debate. So that leaves this tiny little time in terms of, like, time is running. It is becoming more imminent. And so I want to encourage you folks, we are pumped about this and we're determined. Let me show you some of the deets about this, as you might be new to it and you're maybe like, what is that? Like, you guys do a crowdfund? What are you talking about? So we're pumped about this. In particular, evidence for God is the topic of the debate. And believe me, it's going to be epic. Dr. Kenny Rhodes and juggernaut debater Matt Dillahunty will be here on Saturday, June 5th. You don't want to miss that one, folks. And here are the details about this, though. So let me just show you some of the other stuff. You might be like, well, James, are you sure you can do this, like, crowdfund thing? Like, are you sure you're going to make the goal? Believe me, don't bet against us, folks. And I would say, hey, join us in this crowdfund. It's a lot of fun. I'll show you what I jumped in the crowdfund last time. I'll show you what I got for one from somebody else's crowdfund. But long story short, 143 people jumped in last time, and we raised $3,141. That was for our honorariums for Mike Jones and Michael Shermer back in January. So you can see that on the bottom right of your screen. We've successfully done this, and we're going to meet this new goal, which is only about $400 more than the last goal. We are pumped about it, folks. And this gives us, you could say, it opens doors for us. It allows us to take more risks in terms of bigger speakers. So, like, I'm not joking. We do eventually want to get people like Richard Dawkins, Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Sam Cedar, Steven Crowder. Sorry, long day. We are excited about this, folks, and believe me, we are absolutely determined. We're going to make this goal. I don't care if me and T-Jump have to do a car wash in January. It's going to happen, folks, whether it be in January or May. You don't want to miss it. It's going to be absolutely fun. And so let me show you the rest on this crowdfund stuff, though. So you might be like, well, is it easy to get in there? It's so easy, folks. You don't even have to give them your password. If you just go on to the link that I'm going to throw in the chat right now, you can actually get into the crowdfund, and it's also linked in the description. You can actually get into it bypassing all of the sign-in stuff by signing in with your Facebook. So awesome. I just really love that. And so we're really excited about that. You guys, this is going to be epic, and want to let you know about this as well. We have new perks. So some of these you've maybe seen before, and some of them maybe you haven't. Let's see right now. So in particular, from last time, I'm excited. I'm still here. I was just adjusting the screen. Okay, so we're excited for $3. If you want to throw $3 in, folks, that helps us a ton, for real. As like I said, maybe you're even like, I don't even know if I really am like that big on this like topic or on the debaters. Like, I'm not really that big of a fan of Kenny Rhodes or Matt Dillahunty or whatever it is. But I would say, hey, folks, just so we can have a better idea of how well we can use this crowd fund, I would say, hey, I mean, less than the cost of a cup of coffee, you can throw your support in, and it shows us like, hey, this is a strategy that can work for us in terms of getting more high profile debates. And so one, at the lowest tier, you can see is less than a cup of coffee, folks. And then next one up would be helping us make this event huge. We want to do promotion for this, and that depends on how much we're able to raise, whether or not we're actually able to do the promotion. So the next tier just helps us with that a little bit. And then your name on screen is the next one. Some of these you've already seen. In fact, I'd say most of them. So let me show you the next ones. You can see top of the page now, your name read out loud is another tier. And then the Modern Day Debate coffee mug for $25. And want to let you know, this is really important. At every tier, you not only get the reward at that level, but you also get all of the rewards from all of the tiers below it. So let me give you an example. So let's say, for example, you're like, like $50, like, yeah, cool. Like, I feel like this is a fun show, and I hope you guys can like keep improving, the kind of high profileness of the debaters and all that. So want to let you know about this, folks. We're absolutely pumped. Seriously, thrilled. If you were to get the Modern Day Debate t-shirt, $50, you would not only get that, but the embossed postcard, like not much, but also the coffee mug, Modern Day Debate coffee mug, plus your name read out loud, and then as you can see, your name on screen as well. And so let me pull it back up. I'll show you the tiers that are remaining. Modern Day Debate t-shirt I mentioned, then the Modern Day Debate hoodie, which, for example, if you got the hoodie, then you'd not only get the hoodie, but you'd also get the t-shirt, plus the Modern Day Debate mug, and the postcard, and your name on screen, etc. One-on-one Zoom chat with James. I think someone might have just signed up for that. So that we might only have, it might be that now there are 3 out of 5 are taken, such that there's only 2. I've got to check. Somebody signed up for a big donation in the last 24 hours, I think, but I can't remember if it was that. And here's the thing too. Maybe you're like, I don't like any of these tiers, James. Even the meet and greet with the guests, which is obviously going to be epic. Matt's a pleasant fellow. I've gotten to meet Matt in person. We've gotten along, as well as I'm nothing but kind things to say about Dr. Kenny Rhodes. And want to let you know, you're maybe like, well, James, I don't like any of that. You know what? So stick that in your pipe and smoke it. Well, I want to let you know this. You could, even just for $1, throw $1 in. I mean, that's like 90, throw in 99 cents if you're like, I don't know about $1. Throw in 99 cents. Again, that helps support the channel, and we really do appreciate that. And then, I did forget to pin the crowd fund. Riley S. says, I hope you find greater and greater success and recognition. Thank you, Riley S., for that support. That seriously does mean a lot. And B. Badass says, yeah, you got the coffee mugs. That's right. I remember it was your guys' idea in the live chat. You said that it would be cool. Michelle Desert says, thanks. Another great show. So glad you enjoyed it, Michelle. Glad to hear that. And NdoXD says, what's embossed mean? Embossed means it's kind of like, it's almost like a stamp, except it's about like making an imprint. So you use this metal clamp, and then it has the Modern Day Debate logo on the postcard, and then the postcard has the picture of the thumbnail for the debate. So Heat Shield says, day 8, reminding you that nobody reads other people's coffee mugs, but everyone reads laptop stickers and bumper stickers. Better for your channel promotion. I'll buy a dozen. That's good to know, Heat Shield. Maybe. I mean, the trick is, if I do the stickers, for example, on Teespring, it's like $9 for a sticker, which to me, I'm like, what? So if we were to put it as like a perk for the crowd fund, well, we obviously wouldn't want to put, let's say we put it $5 for a sticker. Well, then that's like a $5 loss toward the crowd fund. So that doesn't make sense. So if we put like $12, but some people might be like, $12 is a lot for a sticker. But I don't know. I'll think about it. But yeah, they're kind of unusually expensive from what I've seen. But anyway, at least on Teespring. Actual Socialist Trash says, could you get Bosch versus Steven Crowder with the crowdfund? I honestly think we could. Next time, what I want to do, folks, like, I'm serious. I fully believe in this strategy. After we did it in January during the holidays, like, I really do think we could do some really cool stuff, you guys. So I'm thrilled. And I really think that that is a realistic kind of goal to shoot for. And so, like, for real, that's like maybe the kind of debate we're going to shoot for at the end of the summer. Like, I'm very serious about that, because I'm like, hey, like, let's take some risks now. You know, like, last time our goal was 2,500. Now it's 3,500. The next one we might say, hey, like, let's go for really high profile people, and maybe the goal is like 4,500 or maybe even 5,000, and we shoot for the stars. And like I said, we really want to increase the quality of our guests all the time, including for those headliner debates. And so, yeah, we're excited about it. But want to say hello as well. And Hacks, thanks for coming by. Says, thanks for the debate, James. Thanks, guests. Thanks, mods. Thanks, everyone watching and chatting. I have to go early. Thanks for coming by, and Hacks. We're glad you did make it. And I agree. Thank you, mods, for doing a great job in the chat. We really do appreciate that. And Moomin Rider, good to see you as well. Thanks for coming back here. Louis Preciado, glad you came back as well. And then Reservoir of Gore, thanks for coming by. And Brian Stevens says, I'm new to this channel. Amazing. We're glad you're here, Brian Stevens. Good to see you. And then also, Actual Socialist Trash says, I went back and listened to one of the first few debates on this channel. Seriously, only like 3 comments on this VOD. I love that you have always greeted people in the chat. That's funny. That's really cool. I've always enjoyed it. Like, for me, it's like wanting to do modern day debate. I have wanted to meet people. Like, I enjoy people. And so it's fun for me to, like, whether it be in the chat or in real life, whatever it is. And then Bell Marduk, thanks for coming by, as well as YouTube Surgeon General, thanks for your wink face. Anarchist, thanks for coming by. Glad you were here with us, as well as Larry Cloys, thanks for coming by. But yes, Erica, aka YouTube's favorite daughter, we do appreciate her. She's tremendous, like my little sister. We have to tease, our little siblings. So, pin up. Let's see. Says no evidence. Let's see. Thanks for coming by. And Riley S. Let's see. Got to say hello, as well as Sideshow Neff says, everybody needs a modern day debate coffee mug. Amazing. You won't regret it, folks. And so, yeah, I can tell you, for real, we're excited about it. I am pumped, and I hope that the 12-hour live stream would be another way in which we could raise funds for this crowdfund. And so, yeah, 14 days, like, folks, the time is running out. It just, like, sometimes it's like, man, a year goes by and it feels like a month. Does anybody else have that? I feel like that all the time. But Thermal Rain, YouTube, thank you for coming by, my dear friend. We're glad you're here with us. And then, amazing, David Geralt, thanks for coming by as well. And then, I almost caught up with the chat. You guys are moving fast on me. Let's see. Brian Griffin, glad you came by. And then Gabriel Real says, am I late or early? Thanks for coming by, Gabriel. You are like so late, but we're pumped that you're here while we're hanging out. And Gurmania, thanks for coming by. Says, well, I'm late. Yes, but this is arguably, well, actually, you can't top that debate. That was amazing. But this is the second best part of the night. So it is always fun to get to chat, hang out with you guys, and say thank you guys for your support. And thank you for making this channel amazing. Because seriously, you do. It really, like, your guys' ideas, everything, just being here and being a fun melting pot of different people from different, like, walks of life. Appreciate that. Dave Langer says, we still need a tier where you shave off one eyebrow, maybe for $500. I'll think about it. I mean, I'd have to, well, that's the funny thing is, yeah, I'll tell you a story. But Reservoir of Gore says, great debate. Love the Bigfoot Baywatch imagery near the end. That's funny. Nasty guy. I laughed so much when Erica started laughing. Gabrielle Real says, here once again. Thank you, Gabrielle, for your kind words. And Heat Shield says, whoa, that's through Teespring? Holy moly, maybe do a limited print through Amazon. Yeah, it is unusually expensive on Teespring. I'm baffled by that. But Platium says, good evening, James. Thank you, Platium, for being with us. Good to see you. I'm almost caught up. Amazing, says the Legend Rivs. Thanks for coming by. And then Heat Shield says, I have family in Colorado who do printing. Let me know if you want to talk about that, James. For real, if you email me at moderndaydebate@gmail.com, like that's a great way to do it. I'll even put it in the chat if you want to copy and paste it. moderndaydebate@gmail.com. Heat Shield. I just put it in the chat. I want to encourage you to check that out, as I am pumped about that. And then, yeah, that's right, the Discord. Thanks, Sideshow Nav. Oh, that's right. So we do have a Discord. Sideshow Nav, I think, maybe shared there might be a separate link for mods. Want to let you know a few things for moderators. One, thank you for all you do. Two, we are probably going to do some changes at this channel that we hope improve the channel, and we hope there are several changes I'll talk about. One is I want to give you a heads up so you know what to expect. We're not going to like put it into practice yet, but it is coming, probably starting on Monday, so the new week. We are asking moderators to refrain from putting, I know this is different. You're going to be like, James, this is totally different. You always said the opposite. And it's like, I know, but we do think that there's a good reason for it. Namely, is that the moderators, like you guys are a real part of the channel. So we are asking moderators, and this is something if you're like, yeah, like I don't know if I want to be a moderator anymore. Nobody, like, trust me that I don't ever feel entitled to have your help as a moderator, so don't feel obligated or anything like that. We're happy to have you stay, but if you want to leave, we have no hard feelings. That we're going to ask the moderators to basically not make their, you could say, not argue their positions in chat. Now, if someone like asks you what your position is, like it's okay to say it. We're not going to say you like can't say it or something, but we're going to ask that without people like trying to ask you, and which would probably be rare. We're going to ask you to do the same thing as me, basically, where we're going to be like we're going to be completely nonpartisan. So want to let you know about that. There is something else I was going to mention about that, but I can't remember what it is. I am excited about the culture being so positive, and I do appreciate you in the chat. Those of you guys, 99.9999% of you are so positive, and it's so encouraging. And we do have, folks, we do have Twitch. We do have Discord. Oh, thanks. Hannah Anderson just put it in the chat, and I'm going to pin it. So if you didn't know we have Discord, I would say, oh, man, check it out. Like, you'd be crazy not to. Check out what amazing things Larry Letts, as well as Platium, MathPig, and others have done in terms of making the Discord for Modern Day Debate epic. For real. You won't regret it. Check it out. Thanks for your kind words, Riley S. Says we love you too. That seriously means a lot. And I do appreciate that more than you know. YouTube Search General says, how does one sign up to be a mod? It is hard work, to be honest. Like, being a moderator is becoming harder, where it is actually like, there's like meetings and stuff. So I would just say, like, need to know that. So one thing I want to mention as well. Let's see. Thanks, Riley S., for being cool with it. And then, so the idea, though, is the reason that we want to do it is we have had a lot of people who have said, like, hey, I think what happens is, I didn't know this for a long time. Other channels, the moderators are perceived as, like, if they share their views, they're like, oh, like, well, it must be a partisan channel. So when they come to a nonpartisan channel, like we claim to be, and they see moderators like taking a position on something, they're like, oh, well, I thought this was nonpartisan. And here you've got this moderator giving this political view or this religious view or anti-religious view or whatever it is. And so that is something that we're like, hey, if we want to grow more, we want to have moderators neutral, just like I am, where it's fully neutral. And so new thing, I'm trying to think about what else I was going to say. I'm trying to remember. Be Badass says, that makes sense. Glad you understand. But that's the reason, basically, is we want to be more nonpartisan, and we want to grow and have bigger impact on YouTube. And so I'm not ashamed to say it. Sometimes people are like, hey, like, oh, you want to grow? Because sometimes, like, I see a creator and they're like, oh, I would never lower myself to telling people to subscribe. And I'm like, well, don't you think what you're doing on YouTube is like valuable? Don't you even believe in your own like content? Like, I would say I think that what we're doing is awesome. It's amazing. I'm excited about it. What are we doing? We're providing a level playing field for everybody to make their case on a neutral platform. We think that's valuable. And so my thing is, I'll tell you, folks, absolutely, if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button. We're excited about the future, and we think you're going to be happy that you did hit that subscribe button. It's got a lot of epic stuff coming up. Platinum says, I understand. I completely agree. People do see the moderators as the first hand reaching out to welcome them in. Yeah, I definitely think that's the case. It's something that I didn't really recognize as much until, but I think it'll be a positive change. And then Riley S. says, how I looked at it for this channel was the fact that you took on mods of all viewpoints. That meant there wasn't a specific bias in the chat. Not that I'm arguing. You're right. I do think there is something to that. And that was a good rebuttal, I think. But sometimes people still, I think I think they just don't see it the same way we do in terms of that being neutral. I don't know. It's probably because it is true that some debates, just by coincidence, almost all the mods will be politically right, politically left, religious, non-religious, whatever it is. And so that might be, as they might be like, well, yeah, maybe you are open to mods of different beliefs, but right now all of your mods seem to have this view. And so that's probably why. So Dave Linger says, so if we want to be in discussion for a certain debate, can mods take off the night from modding and use an alternative account to join the discussion? Yes, absolutely. So as long as you don't have that wrench, totally. And so, yeah, I think it's going to be a good and positive change. Like I said, is that it'll be like beyond, what's the word I'm looking for? We'll be beyond above reproach. So like there won't be any way in which a person can like try to argue that we're not neutral. And so, yes, we are excited. I'm trying to think of anything else that I want to share. Yes, folks, we do have Discord in the old live chat. And also, I'm excited about this. Let me show you this. If you haven't checked out our Facebook, I want to encourage you to do this. And the reason is, you might not believe this. I'm pumped that our Facebook page is growing. We're at 980 likes for the channel. So we're almost at 1,000. So I did just put the Facebook link in the old live chat. If you want to go over to the Modern Day Debate, what is it called? Facebook page. And if you just copy and paste that link, www.facebook.com/moderndaydebate, that will bring you there. If you want to like Modern Day Debate on Facebook, we're excited as we approach the 1,000 or 1,000th like. And so we do appreciate your help with that. And I'm trying to think of anything else. We are on Twitter. That's another thing, is if you happen to be on Twitter and you're like, hey, I'd be open to having reminders of like what debates are coming out or coming up. Oh, well, you can find us on Twitter. We put them all on there all the time. And also, last but not least, folks, if you have been living in a cave on Mars with your fingers in your ears, if you didn't know, hey, strap your ears in their seatbelts because we're going to take them on the rides of their lives, folks. We are on podcast. We are thrilled about this. So you can pull out your phone right now. I know some of you are listening via your phone right now. I would encourage you, if you haven't yet, what you can do is you click on your favorite podcast app, like I just did, then type in Modern Day Debate into your search. And then click on Modern Day Debate. All of our debates, every single one of them, are on podcast. Now, every single one in the last year or so, because we just started uploading them in the last year. And so we do sometimes put like our old epic debates. So like once in a while, we'll put one from like 2018 on there, and which is fun. We'll put one on from 2018, back when we were called like Modern Day Hysteria. That used to be our name. Did you guys know that? Little Modern Day Debate trivia. And long story short, that's only on Throwback Thursdays we do that. We do a throwback of an old debate that happened before we started the podcast. But we always put new ones on. And right now, I think we're about 4 or 5 days behind. We're trying to get it so that the new debate will come out like basically the day after. And so excited about that. It's epic. Believe me. I'm encouraged to hear people tell me they listen to it while they're at work. They listen to it while they're working out, exercising, cleaning the house, commuting, long form content. And so we're excited about that. And then Be Bad ASS says, sorry, I wasn't trolling. People were mentioning in the live chat. No worries. I didn't think you were trolling. But yeah, I want to say thank you guys so much for all of your support. We really do appreciate it. And so we're excited about the future. I am pumped, and I just appreciate you guys. So Heat Shield says the podcast links in the description aren't links. Is it redirect restrictions? Oh, maybe. Let me check. I've never actually Oh, you're right. You probably would have to copy and paste. Let me try it right now. But you're right. It should be hyperlinked so people can copy and paste. What is it that I'm looking at? I forgot. If you copy and paste, it works. I just tried it. Yeah. But yeah, we are excited about that, as it's been encouraging to see it grow. And so thanks everybody for your support of the podcast as well. Actual Socialist Trust says, I love modern day hysteria. That's right. That was old school. So thank you guys, though. We appreciate you. We love you. I hope you guys have a great night. I'm excited to see you tomorrow night. We will be live. It's going to be epic. It's going to be juicy. You don't want to miss it. And then you guys, not tomorrow, but 1 week from tomorrow, you know what's going down, right? Let me know that you know what's going down. The 12-hour debate stream with 4 different debates within that time is going down. So we're going to start at 11:30 Eastern time. Not this Saturday, but next Saturday, May 29th. So I'm going to get up at 9:30 in the morning, and I am going to start streaming. And it's going to be the first. We're going to have a debate right then and there, like right at the very start. And then we are going to have some break time in between. And then we are going to have, I'm pumped about it. Maybe you guys will have to watch me play video games. I don't know. I've got to check and see. But after that, we will have another debate, and then another debate, and then one final debate. And by the way, the debate that we're going to end it with will be the finale for the day. Believe me, it's you guys, when you see it, you're going to be like, oh man, this is going to be hot. HAWT. So thanks everybody. I hope you guys are pumped for that 12-hour stream of debates. It's going to be, I'm absolutely pumped. This is our first 12-hour stream. It's going to be all day. So if you're on Saturday, if it's Saturday, at any time during the day, hopefully that's a fun feeling. Anytime during the day, you can pop in and we'll be live. You can just, oh, hey, you guys are still going, huh? For real. So yeah, thanks everybody. Keep sifting out the reasonable from the unreasonable. And I am excited to see you for the next one.